Good afternoon, everybody. If I can have your attention, please, and if we can have people get seated, then we will start the program right away. Thank you very much. All right, wow, this is, I wish all my classes were like this. I have to say it once and everybody gets quiet. That'll be wonderful. That's my wish list for next academic year. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rohit Verma, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Dean of the Darla Moore School of Business at the University of South Carolina. I hope you have heard of it. That's a little school, little bit that side, just around there. And I have the honor of welcoming you to this 45th edition of the Economic Outlook Conference, which we host. So welcome, everybody. We have about 250 people who signed up to be in this room with us in person, and millions of people are watching online. So thank you all of you who are watching online, right? We have no way of knowing, so we have to just assume it's millions. That's the economic forecast, I'm told, right? Okay. Before I say anything else, let me just start by first saying thank you to our sponsors. We have 3 sponsors who have really contributed a lot in making this event successful. The Blue Cross Blue Shields of South Carolina, the Founders Federal Credit Union, and the South Carolina Chamber of Commerce. So thank you so much for your support, all sponsors. Thank you so much. The other group I want to especially recognize is 2 of our lead economists who have done the work which you will get a chance to listen today. We have Professor Doug Woodward and Professor Joey Van Nessen. Doug has been doing this since 1987, if I'm not mistaken, and then Joey from around 2010, okay, 2010. So they have been doing this for quite some time, and they have put together a very strong legacy of creating the impactful statement which they will share with you in a few minutes. So thank you both for all your hard work throughout the year. Thank you. Now, there are 2 very simple reasons why we continue to host these conferences, and I mentioned this is the 45th year. The first one is that you get to hear actionable insights. And these are actionable insights very specific to the economic landscape in the state of South Carolina. They are not theoretical, these are not abstract, something which is very, very actionable. And what we hope is that once you are able to listen to these insights, you will be able to take that information back to your organizations and, very important, make some smart decisions, right? I think that's the key point why we want to always sponsor these events. So, of course, you'll get a chance to hear a lot about the results and so on, but let me just take a minute to tell you about the Darla Moore School in case you do not know about it. We have a little over 6,700 students now and more than 200 full-time faculty. We have close to about 60,000 alumni who are present all over the country and around the world doing some amazing work. And our trajectory in the future looks very strong and very positive. I just heard from our admissions office that this year we passed 19,000 applications just for the Darla Moore School for about 1,500 or so students who we can accept. So it's a good problem to have, let me put it this way. On the other end, I'm very proud to say that our students who are graduating, they continue to get exciting job opportunities, their career trajectory looks good, and they continue to make a big impact here in the state and around the world. One more point about our faculty. 2 of them you would hear from here today, but our faculty continue to create insightful research, which is rewarded both in the academic circle and by the industry. And if you'd like to know more about that, either myself or Joey or Doug, any of us will be happy to connect you with the relevant faculty member. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker. That's Ms. Sarah Hazard. She's the President and Chief Executive Officer of the South Carolina Manufacturers Alliance. Sarah is a well-known advocate and voice for state's 6,000 manufacturers and more than 300,000 employees. And she was appointed to the SCMA's top leadership role after spearheading SCMA government relations group for more than a decade. She has previously served on the boards of South Carolina Economic Developers Association, Sustain SC, and Palmetto Center for Women, which she also chaired. Her leadership and impact has been recognized by Columbia Business Monthly, which named her in its top 50 most influential list. And she is also a recipient of the Columbia Regional Business Report's Women of Influence Award. Sarah is a native of South Carolina, earned a Bachelor's of Arts in Political Science from Presbyterian College, where she also minored in Business Administration and History. And she lives in Columbia with her husband, John, and their 2 children. Please join me in welcoming Sarah to the podium. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 45th Annual USC Economic Outlook Conference. As Dr. Verman said, my name is Sarah Hazard, and I'm President and CEO of the South Carolina Manufacturers Alliance. I made a point today to wear my Gamecock colors, go Gamecocks, in the spirit of USC. This is the second year that the South Carolina Chamber of Commerce has partnered with the Moore School to bring you this event, and we are proud of how this collaboration continues to strengthen the value and impact of the conference for South Carolina's business community. Each year, our goal is straightforward: to provide clear, actionable insight into South Carolina's economic landscape, information that you can take back to your organizations and communities as you plan for the year ahead. But before we get started, I'd like to share some exciting news. Beginning January 1st, the South Carolina Manufacturers Alliance and the South Carolina Chamber of Commerce will officially come together as the South Carolina Manufacturers and Commerce. This merger marks a new chapter for our state's business community. It's one defined by a stronger, more unified voice working to advance economic growth and opportunity across our state. This historic step positions South Carolina for an even brighter and more prosperous future. So it's a very, very exciting time for our organizations and for the business community here in our state. Now, let me take a moment to outline today's agenda. We'll hear from 4 speakers this afternoon. We'll start with Dr. Joey Von Nessen, who will present the economic outlook for South Carolina as we move into 2026. Following Dr. Von Nessen, we'll hear from Cody Thacker of Scout Motors, who will share insight into the timing and structure of Scout's build-out in the Midlands and what that means for our state's growth trajectory. We're then going to take a 15-minute break around 2 p.m., and then when we return, we will broaden the lens. The second half of our program will explore the major forces shaping the long-run outlook for both our state and national economy. Many of us have heard predictions of so-called jobs Armageddon brought on by rapid advances in artificial intelligence. Later this afternoon, we'll take a closer look at whether those concerns are warranted, and more importantly, what realistic expectations that we should have about AI and the future of work here in South Carolina. We'll also hear how shifts in monetary and fiscal policy are likely to influence our economic landscape in the years ahead. Once again, thank you for being here and for your commitment to South Carolina's economic future. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Joey Von Nessen. Dr. Von Nessen is a research economist in the Division of Research at the Darla Moore School of Business, where he specializes in regional economics, regional economic forecasting, and housing economics. He regularly conducts a wide variety of economic impact analysis, feasibility studies, and independent market research projects for clients in both the private and public sector, and has worked with most of South Carolina's major industries over his 16 years at the Moore School. Dr. Von Nessen earned his BA in economics from Furman University and his PhD in economics from the University of South Carolina. We are excited to hear about where our economy is headed in 2026, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Joey Von Nessen.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see everyone. Thank you all for coming out today. It's a pleasure to see so many smiling faces today. Again, my name is Joey von Nessen. I am a research economist with the Darla School of Business here at USC. And we practice in our division of research what some of you have heard me say before, but I always like to use the term, so what economics? Meaning that we're always looking at economic data and asking the question, so what? How can we use economic data to help businesses and organizations make good strategic decisions? And that's what we're going to be talking about all afternoon. And we're going to start by looking specifically at the South Carolina economic outlook, looking at what we've seen evolve in 2025, the changes in our economy this year, and what our expectations are as we move forward into 2026. And as we start out, as we look at South Carolina's economy, and to a certain extent the national economy as well, and try to think about themes for 2025, there are many that we might come up with, but one that recurs over and over again, and one that I think you'll probably agree with me on, is the theme of uncertainty that has emerged in 2025. So most of you would probably agree with this to a certain extent, and certainly a theme, if not the theme of 2025. And I would even add in the adjective pervasive uncertainty, right? Because this has been so extensive throughout 2025. And it's emerged for a variety of reasons that we will talk about this afternoon. But the default thought process that often goes behind this uncertainty, or where our mind goes, is thinking about uncertainty related to trade and tariff policy. And that's certainly part of it. But when we think about uncertainty as the theme for 2025, we want to step back to really get our arms around what this uncertainty means and where it comes from by putting uncertainty into two buckets, trying to assess where we are and what people are considering this year. And we can consider business uncertainty separate from consumer uncertainty. Both are important, and both manifest themselves slightly differently. So on the business side, when we consider uncertainty, this is where we see this uncertainty emerge that most of us consider when we hear that term with respect to trade and tariff policy and the back and forth that we've seen in 2025. And the uncertainty has an effect in the business community in many cases of generating paralysis. Uncertainty often breeds paralysis and causes businesses to go into wait-and-see mode, and to a certain extent we've seen that in 2025. Because they're waiting to get a better understanding of what the economic landscape is going to be, especially with respect to pricing, with respect to their supply chains, with respect to their customer base, if they have to see, or if they have to pass those costs along to consumers. So trying to evaluate what that looks like, and that can cause businesses in some cases to pause investment and hiring decisions. And again, that has implications that we'll talk about. But the other piece of uncertainty that we may not quite hear as much about is uncertainty on the consumer side. And this goes down to, or comes down to rising prices and concerns around affordability. Because when we look at consumers on average and think about what they care about, does the average consumer care about GDP growth? Do they care about monetary policy, what the Fed is doing? You know, what do consumers care about? Well, yes, those things matter, but they primarily matter to the average consumer only to the extent that they affect kitchen table issues. And kitchen table issues are summarized by affordability. But really, I would suggest to you that these are the three kitchen table issues that most consumers are concerned with, and certainly concerned with as we look ahead to 2026. Job security, wages, and prices. If you can't relate any type of broader macro policy down to how it affects these three things, then consumers are less likely to care about what's going on, or they're going to discount it. What they care about is how it influences these three. And in a very real sense, we can even collapse these three into one economic metric that we can track. So people are concerned about whether they'll have a job next year, they're concerned about their income levels, and they're concerned about how quickly prices are rising. And from an economic perspective, we can measure all three really by just tracking this one variable that we call real wage growth, that many of you have I'm sure, seen before. Real wage growth basically just meaning the difference between wage growth and growth in prices. So how much faster are wages growing over prices? Why does that matter? Because what consumers think about, what they care about in terms of affordability is purchasing power. So as you can see here, just think about a simple example. If you see your income rise by about 3% next year, that's great, but if prices are going up around you at about the same rate of 3%, you're not actually any better off. Right? And if prices rise more than 3%, then you're going to be worse off. So we want to look at real wage growth, inflation-adjusted wage growth. And that is a really easy way to encapsulate these kitchen table issues, a way we can track them. So if we do that, it turns out that real wage growth tracks consumer sentiment fairly closely. So there's strong evidence that, for the most part, when we're looking at changes in consumer sentiment and how the consumer feels, it basically comes down to how we're seeing these real-time changes in real wage growth or inflation-adjusted wage growth. And again, the correlation is not perfect, not exactly one-to-one, but they tend to trend pretty closely together. So this looks at consumer sentiment and real wage growth over the previous decade, during the period before the pandemic of the 2010s. And you can see a general trend upwards from, in this case, 2012 to about 2019. And then we can see this move in the opposite direction, right? So we see an improvement in the previous decade, and then we see a very different trend since 2020, right? So consumer sentiment comes down right alongside and maps right along to, or right onto real wage growth. So overall, you can clearly see that these kitchen table issues are primarily what impacts consumer sentiment. Now, if we look to the right side of the graph, if we look ahead to where we are today in 2025, we can see consumer sentiment going back down and also real wage growth really leveling out, which gets us to changes in affordability in 2025 and what we've seen this year. So to really encapsulate or to really focus on changes that consumers have observed this year with respect to concerns over affordability and high prices, we can do an explicit comparison just to see how things have changed, comparing where we are today versus where we were this time last year. And we can do that by looking at cumulative real wage growth going all the way back to 2020. So just comparing where the average consumer is today in terms of purchasing power to where they were in May of 2020, when we began to see an increase in inflation. So clearly you can see the erosion of real wage growth between 2020 and 2022 as prices rise faster than wages when inflation is going up to its 40-year high. Inflation peaks in 2022 at 9.1% and begins coming back down afterwards. And you can see that consumers begin to recover. Wages start to exceed prices again. Wage growth starts to exceed price growth. And so we begin to recapture some of that lost purchasing power. But it's still below zero, right? We're still worse off than we were before the pandemic began. And you can see in the last several years, we've also gained some traction here as well. The slope of that line has actually improved. So we can look and place an arrow there just to get a general sense of the pace of recovery from 2022 to 2023. And then in the last year or so, that's accelerated a bit. And if we do a basic trend line and project outwards, we can see that on average, we would expect for most consumers to recover that lost purchasing power, recover all of it by early 2027. So that's where we were this time last year. So the question is, what has happened in 2025? Has this red line basically stayed on trend? Has it stayed where that trend line would suggest that it might head if we were going to get back to previous purchasing power levels by early 2027? Well, if we map on what's happened in the last year, you can see that we haven't quite made it. We are still improving. Wages are still rising faster than prices, but we have seen an uptick in inflation in the last year, and so that progress has slowed a bit. And if we redo our trend line to see when we're going to recover all that lost purchasing power, instead of January of 2027, now we're looking closer to January of 2028. And this, in a nutshell, is why consumers have remained so cranky in 2025, and we've seen consumer sentiment go down, and regardless of when you compare the time periods, hasn't seen any real meaningful improvement in 2025. So this makes a difference in terms of what consumers are seeing and what they are experiencing. And in a sense, we can see this very, very clearly. We were capturing some momentum there, recovering that lost purchasing power, and we perhaps have moved back a little bit this year, and that's causing frustration among consumers overall. But we also have to look not just at sentiment in terms of how consumers and businesses feel and what their impressions are and how they are responding to this uncertainty, but we also want to look at how it's having practical effects in the economy in South Carolina and at the U.S. level as well overall. So just what are the practical effects? What have we actually seen? Well, the effects are very clear. If we look at what uncertainty has done to business activity and to consumers, what is the net effect? The bottom line is that we have seen a deceleration of growth, both at the national level and in South Carolina in 2025. But despite this deceleration, growth still remains positive. And that second point is very, very important. We've seen a decelerating economy this year, but growth does remain positive. And this is very obvious when we look at the data across different metrics. The easiest way to see this is to look at overall GDP growth for the US economy, where again, these trends are not subtle. They're very obvious patterns, and we can see this. GDP growth has slowed by roughly a percentage point or so over the last year. 2.8% growth in 2024, which slowed to about 1.6% in 2025. This is the annualized growth rate for the first half of the year, so we're just looking through the second quarter. But still, a marked difference, right, compared to what we saw in 2024 of about a full percentage point. So a decelerating economy, but an economy that is still growing, that remains positive. And here's another important point to emphasize when we're looking at this deceleration. It is not economy-wide. It's not economy-wide. This is primarily focused in the goods markets, in the goods sectors. And we can see this in a number of different ways. This is true at the national level. This is true in South Carolina as well. And one easy way to observe this is to just look at consumer spending patterns overall. And we can break down consumer spending, which represents the bulk of economic activity in the US, into spending on goods and spending on services. Collectively, this represents about 70% of total US economic activity. And so what do we see? We can see that services has remained relatively unaffected this year. Consumers continue to spend on services on trend. But if we look at the goods market, things look a little bit different. Again, still positive growth in 2025, but definitely a deceleration. So you can see where this deceleration has come from, in large part because of new tariffs that have been introduced and have affected certain segments of the goods market. And we can see this if we drill down even further. If we look at growth by industry, you can really see the effects. Again, these are not subtle patterns that we're seeing. So at a US level, we can break down employment growth by industry, and this looks at growth in 2025. And I don't know if you can read that in the back in terms of the specific industries, but basically everything above the dotted line represents the major goods markets, the major goods sectors in the US economy. And everything on the bottom half represents the service sectors. And just a quick glance makes it very clear about where the growth is coming in our economy in 2025. It's very obvious, right? It's the service sectors. The service sectors overall, whereas the goods sectors have seen either weak or muted growth in 2025, or in some cases, negative growth. And this is true whether we're looking at manufacturing, whether we're looking at logistics, transportation and warehousing, retail trade. The markets that are more likely to touch international markets are ones that have been somewhat affected. And again, this looks at the national level, and we'll talk about South Carolina here as well in just a moment. Now, there's one major exception to this, at least on the surface, that you might be able to see. So we'll put an arrow on it right there. And that's this sector right there called professional and business services. And anyone who looks at economic data will know that professional and business services is kind of a catch-all sector for a lot of different professional services. A lot of different groups go into this industry. But that is a major service sector. It's a large part of the economy, and you can see it's seen a major pullback as well. But it turns out if we zoom in a little bit on professional and business services, there's a very specific reason that we've seen a bit of a pullback this year, and it's because of a category called employment services. And this largely represents staffing firms. Staffing firms, in turn, are placing workers in a number of different industries, but one major sector that we see, or two major sectors, manufacturing and logistics. So even though professional and business services, again, on the surface, does fall within the service category in terms of how it's defined, it still reflects, the pullback there still reflects what we're seeing in terms of the bifurcation of the goods and services sectors, the bifurcation of our economy in 2025. So again, a very clear difference that we're seeing in these two markets, whereas the service sectors have continued to do well. Now, this also extends into the labor market. We can look at it from a hiring perspective overall in terms of industry growth, but we can also look at it from a labor market specifically, and a very accurate, I would argue, accurate description of the labor market this year is a term that is bandied about a lot. You may have heard this in some form. I wish I could take credit for it. It's a great term, but a lot of people use it. A low hire, low fire economy. In some cases, this is described as a no hire, no fire economy, but this is a very accurate description, I think, of what's going on in the labor market. And we're going to hear a lot more detail about the labor market later this afternoon, but I want to first just highlight how this slowdown that we're seeing more broadly is affecting the labor market specifically. Low hire, low fire, meaning that if we zoom out and look economy-wide, we've seen a slowdown in hiring, primarily because of the goods sectors, but low fire is important too. We still very much have a stable labor market nationally and in South Carolina. So let's focus on the low hire piece of this first, of a low hire, low fire economy. So what do we mean by a low fire economy? It means that we're not seeing any uptick in layoff activity overall nationally and especially here in South Carolina. The labor market remains stable. The easiest way to see this is to look at initial unemployment insurance claims, which this illustrates here. Initial unemployment insurance claims being a measure by which we can look at and examine the rate of change for newly laid off workers. So if you were laid off from your job in South Carolina, then you have the opportunity to file for unemployment insurance. And the first time that you do that, you are considered an initial claimant. And so we can track the number of initial claimants on a weekly basis to get insight into how many people are being laid off. And that gives us real-time information into the health of the labor market. And so what we can do then is compare the number of initial claims on a weekly basis and can compare them across different years. And so what we wanted to do here, just to give you some insight into how changes in claims in 2025 compare to other economies, other economic expansions and recessions, we compare 2025 in green to 2017 in blue and 2001 in red. So unemployment insurance claims by week of the year, they're going to naturally go up by definition because we're looking at a cumulative total. But just compare where we are today in 2025, compare the green line to the blue line, 2017, which was the last time we had an unemployment rate in January that was pretty close to what it was in 2025. So in 2017, we saw a stable labor market, an unemployment rate that actually declined from about 4.4% to 4.0%, compared to the unemployment rate in South Carolina this year, which has remained fairly constant. And you can see initial claims basically are comparable in terms of their overall levels. Ebbed and flowed a little bit, but generally pretty close to one another. By contrast, compare what we saw in 2001. Right? During when the dot-com bubble burst and we saw a recession, unemployment in South Carolina jumped from 4.1% to 6.0% by December of that year. And you can see a striking difference here. So that's what we might be more likely to expect to see during a recession. So this shows us the health of the labor market today, particularly on the no-fire side, and certainly illustrates that the labor market, at least today, is stable and that we are not in any kind of labor market recession. Now, what about the low hire or no hire part of this description? A low hire, low fire economy. Well, clearly we're seeing no real uptick in layoff activity, so the labor market remains healthy from that perspective. But we have seen a slowdown in hiring, as we've talked about already, again, primarily in the goods sectors. But when we zoom out and look at the economy as a whole, you can see this trend downwards that has occurred, particularly at the U.S. level, which you see here in orange, but also a general slowdown in South Carolina. But in South Carolina, we've actually seen a bit of an uptick in 2025. And this leads us to the next key takeaway. Following the fact that we've seen a bifurcated market emerge this year because of the slowdown, South Carolina's economy has remained far more resilient than what we've seen at the national level. We have seen a slowdown in the labor market, but South Carolina has been more resilient. And in fact, South Carolina has actually been number one in the country in 2025 in terms of overall employment growth. So if we look at all 50 states, it turns out that 20 of them in 2025 have seen positive employment growth, and South Carolina has been number one. And so that begs the question as to why. What's going on, and can we expect that to continue? Why has South Carolina been more resilient in the face of this mild slowdown that we've seen at the national level? And the answer is very simple. It's population growth. That's our secret sauce of the South Carolina economy. That's why we've been more resilient in 2025 and in recent years. And what makes us more optimistic going forward about our state in terms of our long-run economic outlook and our state's ability to weather any future recession. Population growth. And once again, these are not subtle patterns when we look at the data. You can very clearly see a difference between what's happening in South Carolina and national trends. So I'll just briefly share with you a couple of data points that illustrate this. If we look since 2020, what we find overall is that our population has been growing at roughly twice the rate of the U.S. You can see the last couple of years here, 1.8% versus 0.9% for the U.S. as a whole. We ranked fourth in the country in 2024. We ranked first in the country in population growth in 2023. And so this broad-based population growth is fueling demand across sectors in South Carolina. And these are trends that are likely to continue as well. If we look at forecasts for migration patterns in the United States, it turns out that the southeastern United States is going to see more population gains than any other over the next several decades. So these types of population growth trends are going to continue, and again, give us a major reason to be bullish about the long-run outlook for South Carolina. Again, driving high level of demand across sectors. And we see this very clearly. Again, not subtle patterns when we look in the data. So if we ever wonder why South Carolina is more resilient in the face of economic slowdowns like we have seen in 2025, this is why. So this looks at the largest sectors in South Carolina and just compares growth rates over the last 2 years. South Carolina in blue, the United States in orange here, and you can see across the board, we see South Carolina doing better, including in manufacturing as well, which has seen a slowdown in 2025. Manufacturing growth this year has actually remained positive in South Carolina, again, bucking national trends. But the biggest difference here, as we've highlighted, as I've circled, is construction and professional and business services. And we're gonna throw out those employment services for just a moment to not confuse the issue. But think about professional and business services and construction as wildly outpacing what we're seeing at the national level. Now, construction is largely because of that population growth. That relationship is very clear, right? When we have more people moving in, that creates a higher demand for housing and for other infrastructure and construction-related activities, industrial construction. And in fact, construction and real estate have done better than the U.S. average in 2025 by about 3 to 1 in terms of our relative growth rates. So the state has really bucked that national trend, again, directly because of these population gains. But we also see it in professional and business services as well. Again, that broad catch-all category for a lot of different services overall. And one of the advantages that South Carolina has, particularly in 2025, is that we are not as reliant on the tech sector for our growth. And Dr. Ulrich is going to talk more about this afternoon in terms of the impact of the tech sector and AI and the AI bubble, the so-called AI bubble. But one thing we're seeing in South Carolina is this professional and business service sector this growth is coming from a wide variety of services, a diversity of professional services locally. It's not all concentrated in tech and tech-adjacent fields, unlike what we're seeing in many other major markets in the country. So think about some of the layoffs that we've heard about this year from companies like Amazon and Microsoft and others. So tech-related layoffs, we haven't experienced that here, certainly not to that extent. And so as a result, this large professional and business service sector continues to do well, benefiting from overall demand. So a big difference in what we're seeing in South Carolina versus some of these national trends. And this bifurcated market also looks at differences in regions, or also explains differences in regional growth patterns that we've seen in 2025. So we can compare South Carolina's overall growth rate in terms of employment to the major metropolitan regions of the state, and just take a look at the outliers, right? So who's deviating from this state average of 1.7% the most? Well, it's very clear. It's Greenville, Spartanburg, the upstate, and Myrtle Beach. The upstate has the highest concentration of manufacturing in South Carolina. So again, still positive growth, but you can see where that bifurcated economy has filtered down and has had an impact in South Carolina. We've been more resilient overall, but we have still been affected. Myrtle Beach, by contrast, turns out I'm constantly surprised at how fast Myrtle Beach is growing and how far up they are on lists of overall population growth. They're the third fastest growing metropolitan region in the country. Third fastest in the country. And they've been in the top 10 for a significant period of time. So Myrtle Beach really is going gangbusters. A lot of that is construction and real estate, but not exclusively so. So Myrtle Beach continues to do very well. And again, that ties straight back to the population growth, the secret sauce that South Carolina has. So what does this tell us then as we begin to transition and look forward? So far we've been looking backwards at what's been happening in 2025. We've seen this increase in uncertainty in 2025, both on the business side as well as on the consumer side. On the business side, we've seen that take the form of companies that have been looking to postpone, in some cases, investment and hiring decisions or change them to a certain degree. We've seen it impact prices, and we've seen that affect demand. Meanwhile, the service sector continues to do very well, so a much more bifurcated market. We've seen that it's led to a mild slowdown overall, and even though South Carolina has been affected, we've been largely resilient, and certainly more resilient than what we've seen at the national level, in large part because of our secret sauce, our population growth. So what does this imply about going forward? What can we say about 2026 as we look ahead? Well, the first thing we want to look at is the primary driver of overall growth. What's the primary driver of growth in our economy? We've already talked about that. We've already touched on it. It's consumer spending. So we want to look at consumer spending patterns again, and specifically we want to evaluate what predicts consumer spending, get some insight into how we can expect consumer spending patterns to potentially change as we move into the new year. So here, before we were looking at long-term trends and we were looking at goods and services, here we can roll it up and look at it in the short run and just look at overall growth patterns. So you can see consumer spending, in this case, growth since 2022. It ebbs and flows, of course, from month to month, but in general, you can see the pattern. You can see positive growth in 2025, but consumer spending that has slowed somewhat compared to what we've seen in the last couple of years. Again, we've seen this primarily has been a result of changes in the goods sector. So what does this tell us about the future? Are we going to see stable consumer spending? Is it going to pick up again? Is it going to recede further? What do we need to be on the lookout for to assess potential future changes? Well, there are a couple things that we can look at that turn out to be good predictors for where consumer spending is likely to head in the future. The first is the overall delinquency rate for consumer loans. Now, this ebbs and flows on a month-to-month basis for a variety of reasons, but turns out that the delinquency rate is a pretty good metric for future changes in consumer spending. And right now, through the third quarter, this actually is a good leading indicator in terms of a good omen going forward in terms of where consumers are, meaning that delinquency rates have leveled off in 2025, right about 2.7%, as you can see here, and appear to be relatively stable. So no red flag here when we look at these data. Now, looking at the delinquency rate more generally, when does it generate a red flag? When do we really become concerned? It's usually when this rate, when that 2.7%, if that gets up above about 3.5%, certainly to 4%, that's when we begin to see some concern about a risk for a pullback in consumer spending that would be meaningful. So right now, really no concerns, at least at this point, with respect to delinquency rates, that we're on the precipice of seeing a major pullback in any type of consumer spending. But it's not all just about the delinquency rate. We have other measures as well. Turns out the second measure that does a pretty good job of forecasting where spending is going in the future, as you would expect, is personal income, real personal income growth. If your income is growing, then you're more likely to spend. If it's not, then you're likely to cut back, right? So very obvious connection point there. So the question is, are we seeing any major changes in real personal income growth? And again, you can look back and look at overall trends, comparing where we are today to where we were before the pandemic began. In general, we've seen a bit of a softening in the growth in 2025, in part because we've seen rising prices, which I'm going to come back and talk about in a moment. But in general, once again, no red flags here. So these growth rates are fairly stable and don't point to any major change in momentum for the consumer, at least not in the immediate future in the coming months. So overall, if we look at leading indicators for consumer spending, things look fairly stable as a whole as we move into 2026. And then finally, we can look at the business side as well. There are a number of different metrics to look at overall business activity, business output, and I'll just share one with you. Most of them reflect, again, very similar trends that you see here. The overall industrial production index, which combines a number of different factors. But basically what we've seen with this and other measures is that industrial output, especially if you zoom out and just look at the US as a whole, obviously when we zoom in, we see more of a bifurcated market. But if you zoom out, industrial output has remained fairly steady. So again, no major immediate sign that we're going to see a significant shift in the business landscape in terms of overall production levels. So when we sum all this up and we put everything together, what we see is that the US consumer and business activity both remain stable as we move into 2026, but, and it is a big but, there isn't much wiggle room for further cooling, right? So we have exhausted a lot of this excess growth, in a sense, excess capacity of growth, because we've seen a mild slowdown in the economy. So we're not as well positioned to absorb a shock at the US level going forward. So stable growth, we see a consumer and business activity that remains stable, but again, not much wiggle room for further slowing in the new year. And that's why the discussion a lot of times comes back to the uncertainty specifically surrounding tariffs. Why do tariffs get so much attention? And the answer is very simple, that tariffs are nothing more than a tax on certain imported goods, and so they're going to increase prices for those goods. And to the extent that that increases prices for consumers as a whole, that will make it harder for them to continue to spend at their current levels. And as we've seen, consumers are still trying to claw back that lost purchasing power. They're still in the hole from everything from the losses associated with the pandemic and the inflation that followed. So we are more at risk from a pullback in consumer spending if inflation continues to tick up. So again, this is why it's such a concern and why it comes back into the conversation over and over again. So let's spend just a couple of minutes talking about inflation to get a sense of the real risk here. We know it is a risk if we see it going up next year, because of what's happening with the consumer and the high prices we're seeing already. But is it likely to continue to tick up significantly in 2026? Well, first, let's take a look and just get an overall assessment. Where is inflation right now? What's it been doing? So inflation, the latest data that we have for the CPI is 3.0% from September of this year. And this just gives you a sense of inflation. This goes all the way back to 2016. And just gives you a sense of how inflation has been ebbing and flowing over the last decade or so. And if you step back, you can obviously see the 9.1% inflation that peaked back in the summer of 2022. You can see the pullback since then, and inflation, as I mentioned today, at 3.0%. So we step back from that and you take a look and say, well, has inflation ticked up significantly in 2025? Has it really jumped up a lot? And at least from this picture, the answer is no, it really hasn't. We've seen an increase over the last year from 2.4% in September of 2024. But again, not a sizable increase, and certainly nothing comparable to what we've seen in the last several years. And so this begs the question as to why. Why haven't we seen inflation go up more, given the concerns that it might happen in 2025? Well, there are three reasons why, at least three reasons why, I should say, that I'll briefly share with you. The first reason is that despite the fact that the increase in inflation that we've seen over the last year has been primarily coming from the goods sectors, so generated by some of the new tariffs that have been introduced in 2025, this still represents a very small percentage of the total economy. So here you can see the uptick in inflation since April. Everybody remember Liberation Day back on April 2nd? So tracking inflation since then. So you can see a mild uptick in inflation in the goods sectors overall. But the goods sectors collectively only represent about a third of our economy. The service sectors represent the other 2/3. And within the goods sector, only a small percentage represent imported goods, and of those, only a certain percentage have new tariffs applied to them. So we're still talking about a relatively small percentage of the total economy that these tariffs are applied to. Secondly, in addition to that, if we look at inflation, especially over the last several years, a huge chunk of it has been coming from changes in housing prices, in shelter costs. That's been another major driver. And so if we look at the growth in sales prices this year, at the national level or in South Carolina, here we're looking specifically at the median sales price in South Carolina, what you can see is much more stability in the housing market. This is also true when we look at sales activity, which has returned to pre-pandemic norms. But the same is true when we look at sales prices. Sales prices are still growing. We're still seeing house price appreciation, but at levels that are much more comparable to where we were before the pandemic began. But everything, for the most part, again, still above zero, the black line there. And if we look at shelter costs, that by itself represents about a third of the CPI, a third of what goes into the CPI. So we've had one of the biggest components of inflation as we measure it that has really come down, that has really tapered and stabilized, coupled with the fact that the tariffs have affected a very small percentage overall. So we would expect as a result that yes, we're going to see an increase in prices when we see these new tariffs, but not necessarily as significant as we might have otherwise expected. Second reason, what are the tariffs rate? What are the actual tariffs being paid? What is the effective tariff rate? Turns out that what companies are paying is different from what we're seeing in terms of the statutory rate, because there are a lot of exemptions that have been carved out for different industries, for different regions, for a variety of different reasons. And there are different organizations that are pretty good at tracking these differences, the statutory rate versus the actual rate. So these are data from the Yale Budget Lab. And you can just look at the difference between the actual rate that companies are paying versus what is published, the statutory rate. And some of the latest data that we have suggests maybe a 7 percentage point difference or so in terms of what companies are actually paying versus what we see published. And that makes a difference as well. So tariffs aren't, in terms of what companies are paying, aren't necessarily as high as what we see from a statutory perspective. And then finally, there's a third piece of this as well, which is that businesses are, to the extent that they can, trying to actually shield consumers from any price increases from these tariffs. Because businesses are aware, just as all of us are, that consumers are frustrated and that they can't necessarily tolerate additional price increases before they start cutting back on spending. That is a big concern that we've talked about, and businesses are very much aware of this. And so if they can, they're trying to shield consumers. Now, they can do this in a number of different ways, but I'll just point out one way that's very obvious when we look at the data, and that's this big uptick in imports that we saw in early 2025. We saw a surge in the first quarter, followed by a pullback in the second quarter. Right? Very obvious change in the long-run trend of these data. So what's going on? Why did imports surge in the first quarter? And the answer is very straightforward. It's because companies were anticipating that these tariffs were going to take hold, and so they were looking to get ahead of them, stock up on inventory at lower prices, And that way, they didn't have to pass costs on to the consumer. They can use those inventories that they'd already purchased and stocked up on. But this is also a temporary effect, right? So over time, businesses are going to exhaust these existing inventories, and eventually they're going to have to address any challenges that are associated with higher prices. And that could be passing costs along to consumers. It could be looking at looking at different supply chains or adjusting their supply chains. So there are a number of ways to handle that. But this has been a temporary fix for certain companies in certain markets to be able to try and get around the tariffs or try to minimize the effect on consumers. So 3 very specific reasons why we've seen tariffs go up in 2025, but the effects on inflation have been fairly limited, at least to date. And this also partially explains why the Federal Reserve has been able to focus more in recent months on the labor market, because they're aware of all these things too. They see prices rising in certain sectors, and they understand that the price increases have so far been fairly limited, and that inflation hasn't seen a spike. It has gone up, but the effects have been fairly limited so far. And so they've turned their attention back to the labor market and are able to focus more on the labor market and trying to shore that up to the extent that that is necessary. And it allows them to look at figures like this. So this is, I think, a very helpful way to think about what the Fed is looking at and really summarize the data that they're seeing. This looks at U.S. monthly job gains. Just a straight picture. This goes back to January of 2023 and looks at how many jobs the U.S. is generating every month. And the Goldilocks scenario, where we want to be from a labor market perspective, again, forget about inflation for a moment. Let's just think about the labor market. Basically, we want to be between those 2 black bars. We want to be between 100 and 200,000 jobs per month. That's the sweet spot. That's the Goldilocks rule. And so you can just do a quick scan and look from left to right and say, okay, well, do I see any major white spots there, any major gaps in the blue bars or large areas of white space that cause me concern, that would suggest very low job growth? And so just a quick scan, I would suggest that, yes, there are 2 spots where you could arguably make that case. And we can highlight them, and there they are. And so what do we see? Well, it turns out that one space is during the late summer of 2024, when we saw interest rates begin to go down last year when the Fed took action, and then again in 2025. So this is what the Fed has been focused on, and we're going to talk more about monetary policy later this afternoon, but this is what the Fed can focus on and has been focusing on more in recent months, including yesterday, where we saw the Fed cut rates by 25 basis points. And one of the reasons is because, again, inflation, while it has seen some uptick this year, for a variety of reasons, has not been as significant as many had thought earlier in 2025. And we expect for that to continue as we move ahead into 2026. For these reasons, we don't anticipate that there will be a significant uptick in inflation in 2026, given where we are today. Inflation may not yet have peaked, but we don't expect it to see a significant uptick next year. So, as we wrap up, what is the bottom line? As we look at our state and our national economy, the bottom line comes back to our 3 major takeaways that we've addressed. A significant increase in uncertainty in 2025, no question about that. On the business side and on the consumer side, that's led to a mild slowdown overall at the U.S. level, as well as in South Carolina. But the South Carolina economy remains healthy. We have seen most industries that have continued to see positive growth. And our secret sauce, again, is that population growth, which has made us more resilient in 2025 and also makes us more bullish as we look ahead even beyond 2026. But we do see that bifurcated economy. And in 2026, we continue to expect that the uncertainty coupled with the strong population growth will mean that the service sector will likely be the main driver of growth, particularly healthcare demand in 2026. And if we look at the risk factors associated with any additional slowdown, the key metric to watch next year, if there's nothing else that you look at, you want to keep your eye on inflation. You want to keep your eye on inflation. Why? Because inflation, an uptick in inflation, is more likely to have a significant impact on growth next year than it ordinarily would because consumers have already lost so much purchasing power. So if we were to see any meaningful uptick in inflation next year, that could have a disproportionate effect on consumer spending and limit any further upward potential for growth. But on the flip side, if we do see inflation level off at around 3%, perhaps slightly higher, but peak at between around 3 to 3.5%, then that also puts the Federal Reserve on a path to additional rate cuts in 2026. Again, we'll talk about the specifics of that later this afternoon, but that could potentially boost growth next year in 2026. So we are cautiously optimistic about the new year. We look forward to 2026. But again, the economy walking a bit more of a tightrope this year, at looking ahead to 2026, simply because we don't have the capacity to absorb a major shock, simply because growth has been a bit milder due to the slowdown that we've seen this year. So I will stop there. Thank you all very much for your attention. And depending on time, we may take a couple of questions, maybe 2 questions before we wrap up. Yes, go ahead. So Newberry, it depends on the market. So if we look at the smaller MSAs, they have been fairly resilient as well. The one that has done the best in South Carolina has been Sumter, actually, in the last year, has seen some growth there. Part of that is healthcare as well. So a lot of it is because of the aging population, particularly in the smaller areas. Because most of the population growth, we really didn't talk about this, but it's shifting more towards the metropolitan regions because that's where the job growth is. About 85% of the job growth in South Carolina in the last decade has been in just 12 counties, to give you an extent of how extreme that has been. So the older population is more concentrated in these rural areas, so healthcare is really what's driving the demand there. And that's true in most of these smaller areas that you've talked about. Yeah, one more question. Yes, sir, in the back.
Is there any data that suggests any trends on the outcomes of retaliatory tariffs in our state?
Yeah, the outcomes on the retaliatory tariffs, that's a great question. It's, the short answer is no, we don't have good data on what the net effect for South Carolina has been. And the problem is that tariffs are, there are positives and negatives associated with it. There are costs and benefits. So they can certainly benefit certain industries at the cost to others. So for example, if you look at steel and aluminum tariffs, that can potentially benefit manufacturers in South Carolina, steel and aluminum manufacturers, but to the extent that their customers, say the auto industry, for example, are also located in the state, that can have an effect in the opposite direction. So what's the net impact? That's very hard to gauge. But unfortunately, we don't really have a good answer to that in terms of what the net effect has been on South Carolina. It's very industry specific. All right, well, I think we're out of time. Thank you all very much for your attention.
All right, thank you, Joey. Next up this afternoon, we are pleased to welcome Cody Thacker. Cody is the Vice President of Commercial Operations at Scout Motors, Inc., a manufacturer of all-electric trucks and SUVs that is currently constructing its first production facility in Blythewood, South Carolina. Scout Motors is developing a proprietary electric vehicle platform that delivers both off-road performance and family hauling capabilities, staying true to the utility and orientation of this iconic Scout brand that became synonymous with adventure in the 60s and 70s. As the leader of commercial operations at Scout Motors, Cody is responsible for sales and marketing, service and parts, retail strategy and operations, digital products, and customer experience. Prior to joining Scout Motors in 2022, Cody served as the head of parts business at Porsche Cars North America, where he managed national parts sales, demand planning, warehousing and logistics, and technical support desks. Cody received a BBA in risk management and insurance from the Terry College of Business in 2001 and a JD from the University of Georgia School of Law in 2005. Cody is a native of Alpharetta, Georgia, and lives in Fayetteville, Georgia, with his wife and 3 young children. Please join me in welcoming Cody Thacker to the stage.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, we should get the hard conversation out of the way first, which is, I am indeed a bulldog, and y'all invited me anyways, and I appreciate that. So thank you very much for having me today. But if you saw Saturday night in the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, I think we could unite in our joy that we felt. Good outcomes all around. Well, look, I can assure you, my economic data will be nowhere near as compelling as Joey's, but I can also assure you my pictures will be far better. So buckle up. Before we dive in, just a quick picture of where I've been the last few weeks. I've gone from the land of palms to palmettos. But this was our exhibit at the LA Auto Show over the last few weeks. So you've probably seen all of the dirt on I-77, which begs the question, is this thing real? Is a product happening? What's maturing at Scout Motors? Well, this is it. As you can perhaps see in the photo, we have our Scout Traveler, our Scout Terra in the background. We also ran the Baja 1000 this year. Our race truck is there. We had a merchandise truck, so plenty of t-shirts and hats all around the Los Angeles metro area now. But for me, it's quite special because it's a chance to interact with consumers, get market response to what we're doing, and in a word, fantastic. A lot of coverage. One YouTuber, Forrest Jones alone, 15 million views, so tremendous market response to what we're doing right here in South Carolina. All right, now, let's go back to the beginning. Here's what I intend to cover today, quick table of contents. I'm fully aware some people quite fluent in Scout Motors and our history. Others may be learning about it for the first time today. So I'll give a quick intro to the company, let you know what sort of products we're making. Next, a glimpse into what we're building in the Carolinas. A market outlook, quick comment or two on electric vehicles, determining is our powertrain strategy the right one. And finally, I know there's some AI topics later in the day, so I just wanted to give a quick peek into how AI is being utilized at our company. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. This is 2022. Myself, our CEO, our VP of Strategy, we were the first 3 employees at the company, and we really had to take a first principles approach. What matters? How are we forming this company? What is our intent as we bring it to life? I mean, this was it. This was the recipe. First we realized that this is an iconic brand. We have tremendous brand equity. There's a tribe. There's a community. Let's leverage that. Next, we realized we are in this very special American moment. So this is 2022, before the current climate, and we realized there's a demand to make things again. There's a demand to manufacture in America. We need supply chain resiliency. We need to restore American communities. People value American-made products. So let's make this an American-made approach. At the same time, starting an auto company, very capital-intensive, very technical, it's difficult. So although we're a startup, our sole investor is Volkswagen Group. Let's bring their expertise to the table so that we can get into volume, high-quality manufacturing from the get-go. And then third, we talked to a lot of consumers, held consumer product groups all across the country. And it's clear that we need to deliver credible products to the market. These things need to work. They need to be capable of adventure. They need to perform. So this was our opportunity to make an American product for the American consumer, meeting American product requirements. So this was the start. In the product, how does that manifest? Well, our shorthand is saying we're going to bring the best of the old world into the best of the new world. Yes, people still know how to work door handles, so we can put real door handles on the vehicle. People like their fan speed to be on a switch. They like a tactile switch in the car. So let's bring those things in. Yeah, tactile switches, heavy-duty suspension, ladder frame construction, best of the old world is in this vehicle, but also the best of the new world. We have a chance to bring an electric powertrain in that offers huge horsepower, huge torque, incredible performance. I mean, truly supercar performance out of these vehicles. And that allows us to make a machine and a company, really, that's tailored to this moment. One, I believe, look, America is looking for optimism again. If you can start building things, if you can provide good paying jobs, if you can provide products that give you access to adventure, access to the outdoors, we can instill that optimism again. You see this in the consumer data, and I think I have this as the next chart. Americans want to make again. You see this in HGTV programming and Magnolia Network. This is the Chip and Joanna Gaines movement. If Americans want to make things again, if you can provide the tool that helps them to do that, you have an advantage in the marketplace. And last, the megatrend that we see is, Americans are yearning for a digital detox. We spend too much time on our phones, on social media, in front of TVs. Americans are yearning for a way to connect with their children, with their families, with the outdoors again. So this is how our company, our products are really fitting this special moment that we're in. Text is far too small here, so let me just summarize it quickly. But consumer data is really matching this intent that we have. One, more people than ever are doing home repairs. Next, more people than ever, since the 1970s, I should say, are moving to small towns again. More people moving to small towns than to large cities. And half of America now visits a national park every year. The way we put this is access to the outdoors is the new luxury. Also, market environment, Joey said it, filled with uncertainty. And to state the obvious, very hard to build companies in the midst of uncertainty. Yes, it's trade policy, yes, it's tariffs, but it's also things like CARB and their authority. It's things like CAFE standards. So we have to be very flexible, very adaptable in how we approach this. And last, market observation, localization. The products, the segments that we're competing in, very, very strong bias for American-made products. And we see those dominating the portion of the industry that we are in. Now, a brand comment, I think we have a chance for huge differentiation when it comes to brand. We made this observation. If you look at all of these other brand logos, it looks like a replication of like Swedish death metal. Very pointy, very sharp, very intimidating. If you look at their ad copy, if you look at their commercials, it's things like adrenaline fuel, dominate the terrain, tear stuff up, go knock over trees. Very antisocial, very hostile, really not matching the American moment that we are in. So Scout stands alone. We are about connecting with each other, building bonds, building friendship, building family time. And you'll see this in the product itself. We're building a connection machine as a company and for our products. So this brings us to our mission. I mean, this is what we're doing. We're making these useful, functional vehicles. They can take the kids to school. They can be the grocery getter. They're right at home on the farm, right at home on the trail. We're making these for explorers, doers, makers. And where are we investing? It's in community. It's in neighborliness. It's in warmth. That's our brand, that's our North Star. That's what we aim to achieve. All right, and everybody wants to see the product, so let me just click through a couple of these. Here's the credibility I talked about, body-on-frame construction, solid rear axle, mechanical lockers, big tires, very capable, very credible vehicles, really keeping that original DNA from Scout. Here's some of the performance statistics, as I mentioned. Very capable of delivering a 0 to 60 time under 4 seconds on these vehicles. We'll see, we need to engineer in durability, so we'll see what we get to market with, but this is absolutely within the technical capabilities of the vehicle. Huge hauling, huge towing capability, and we heard clearly from the many, many truck buyers we talked to, give us at least a 5-foot bed or we're not even considering it. We gotta put a sheet of plywood, a sheet of drywall in the truck bed. So full-size truck, with a 5.5-foot bed. Here's a glimpse at the interior. This is where Connection Machine really comes to life. We're bringing back the bench seat. This is an option in the vehicle. So your sweetheart, your child, your dog can now ride with you in the front seat. Yeah, we also have things that have gone out of vogue in the market, like a split rear tailgate. This allows you to put the tailgate down at the campsite, at the tailgate. You have a built-in seat. And here's the real breakthrough. This was the unlock for us. In a headline, we call it Refuel Anywhere. We have added a gas-powered generator to our EV platform. So if you have a garage, if you can plug in at home, if you're getting electricity at 12 cents a kilowatt hour, you can fuel for next to nothing. So fuel there, fuel at home. However, if you're on the road, if you're on a long-distance trip, put gas in the vehicle. With our extended range electric vehicle, EREV we call it, with the gas generator, this vehicle is capable of over 500 miles of range. So it really matters to that general contractor, to the person who's hauling, towing, to the family that's making a long-distance trip. Okay, and these things, are they a PowerPoint slide? Are they fictitious, or are they real? Well, a few weeks ago, we were at the site in Blythewood with what is now our 5th generation test mule, so that we could experiment with suspension, traction control, chassis dynamic, all of these things that have to be proven out before production, and here's a quick glimpse of how that went. All right, so that's the Scout Traveler. It's real, it's happening, coming to life. Public reaction, I think generated a lot of great headlines at this point, kind of validating the decisions that we've made. You can read these here, but The Verge, this is how you restore an iconic brand. Stuff that we love to see, and look, we're only doing this to serve the public, to benefit the consumer, so it's nice to see that that's being recognized in the headlines. All right, now, what are we building here? Really 2 centers of gravity that we're developing for our company. One, the production center in Blythewood, and second, the corporate headquarters in Charlotte. Between there, a lot of other development that's happening. I think many of you probably saw the Orangeburg announcement about a week ago. So a lot of the supply base coming to life to serve the plant as well. So just to double click on these, this is where we started. In fact, in, 3 years ago now, as we were traveling across the company looking at manufacturing sites, this was the very first building that I stepped foot in South Carolina. This is where we were introduced to Secretary Lightsey, to Jeff Rubel, to many others I think that are in this room, and this is where we first discovered how special South Carolina is. There is an ecosystem here that's really unrivaled. And the slide says it. First, you have forward-thinking, engaged, visionary leadership in this state. From Governor McMaster, Secretary Lightsey, to Richland County, it's a group of people who not only get it, but who come prepared with all the right expertise. And as a company, that makes all the difference in the world. We have business-minded leadership who are eager to find solutions and work together. Check on that. Next, the infrastructure. Highways, ports, all of these things matter. Rail access, electricity, water. You need those in abundance to run a large-scale manufacturing plant. And then, the third big pillar here is labor availability. And availability is just the start. Can you get a trained workforce? And South Carolina should be proud. Visionary view of how to do this. That's reflected in the Ready SC program. It's reflected in the technical college system. Not only is the workforce available, but they come trained, skilled, ready to work. And that makes all the difference in the world. I can tell you, of the 74 manufacturing sites that we looked at across the country, many of them met the technical requirements, had the right infrastructure, had the right soil quality, the soil dynamics. It was really that labor question that decided who made the final cut. Now, that last bullet point, supply base, supply chain, another area where South Carolina has a huge advantage. A massive portion of our supply base is located within a couple hundred miles of Blythewood. And then you can also see what's reflected here is our America manufacturing approach. 80% of our total cost base, so the cost of all of the inputs that are coming into the factory are sourced within North America. So it gives us supply chain resiliency, allows us to really implement all of these lessons that were learned during COVID. And here's the factory. I think many of you know these stats, but this is what we're building. 1,600-acre site. It's 1,100 acres that are under development. $2 billion investment by Scout Motors, and 4,000 or more direct employees will work at this site at run rate. We have recently announced a supplier park that will be built on site here. That's an additional $300 million investment, an additional 1,000 employees. And yeah, something like 6,000 follow-on jobs result from this plant. Yeah, and here's just in one view what it looks like. Cumulative investment, $2 billion, as I mentioned, 4,000 direct employees, and yeah, total economic impact within the next few years exceeding $15 billion. Of course, it doesn't stop there. We're always looking to do more. Still, there are investment opportunities for us. This is just one example that I pulled in. We're looking to create both a literal and a figurative front door for the factory, what we call the Blythewood Experience Center. So this is where you would come to take delivery of your vehicle that's just been produced, take a factory tour. We can have community events, community gatherings here, historical displays, and then also driving experiences. So significant economic impact that could also come from these sorts of follow-on projects, which will come to life in the coming years. Yeah, and then lastly, Charlotte. Yeah, we recently announced that our corporate headquarters, employing something like 1,200, will come to life in Charlotte. Really, it's within 70 miles of the factory, so allows us to take advantage of all of those synergies. We're a close drive to the factory. Also allows us access to the white-collar talent that we need. Design, engineering, R&D, all of the corporate functions will be housed at this location. All right, now, a quick comment on the market. If you only read the headlines, you would think, gosh, EVs have imploded. This is a horrible strategic decision. Nobody's buying these things anymore. Let's just put gas in these things. Well, once you get into the data, there's a much different story to tell. The EV market, year to date, quarter over quarter, is still growing at a really rapid clip. Now, there is some noise in here. There was some demand pull ahead because of incentives going away in Q3. So this is perhaps slightly overstated. But if you look at it on a long-term basis, EVs have been growing at a 35% compound average growth rate for now a decade. Now, mind you, 2018, 2019 was the peak market for internal combustion engine vehicles. The US has been selling fewer and fewer ICE vehicles every year since that peak. So if you're choosing which powertrain to invest in, you're clearly going here to where there's the 35% CAGR. On a global basis, today, 1 in every 2 vehicles sold in China is an EV. 1 in every 4 vehicles sold in Europe today is an EV. And those numbers are going up rapidly. So why is that? I mean, it really reflects the product attributes, the product advantages. Very low cost to own, very low cost to operate, huge performance. Every family hauler can perform like a supercar now. Torque is quite addictive, and once you experience that one time, it's very hard to go back to an internal combustion engine vehicle. We see it in survey after survey. AAA does a survey of existing EV owners and what vehicle they're likely to buy next. Depending on the survey you look at, it's something like 90 to 95% of existing EV owners intend to make their next vehicle an EV. So to me, that says the experience is better, the cost to own and operate is better. These products offer a real advantage in the marketplace. So you can see on a global basis what's happening. ICE vehicles have already reached their peak, continue to decline in volume, and EVs in some variant, whether it's a plug-in hybrid, whether it's a full hybrid or a pure battery electric vehicle, begin to dominate the market. Now, we fully expect the US to be a laggard here, to have slower uptake. That's been the trend, but still significant EV growth ahead in the United States. Top left is the EPA's forecast. They're now looking at something like a third of the market in the 2030s to be internal combustion engine vehicles. Our view is that it's probably something more like 50%. The remaining 50% of the market gets split between pure BEVs, plug-in hybrids, and these extended range vehicles like we're making, which is the EV with the gas generator. Now, where I would say our strategy is quite clever is that we've designed the factory in a highly flexible way, very sophisticated machinery and robotics so that we can flex the factory to consumer demand. We know that all this uncertainty is in the system, so we want to be in a position where we can be responsive to that. So if consumer demand, incentives go the way of full battery electric vehicles, we can put 100% BEVs down our assembly line. Same platform, same assembly line. If the market goes to EREV vehicles with the gas generator, 100% of our production can be dedicated to these EREVs. So we're ready for that. We can respond to whatever the market holds in the future. Last comment, I think this has good explanatory power. Why do we believe that EV growth continues to accelerate? It's primarily driven by the cost of high voltage batteries. That is the most significant, priciest component in an EV. And if you look at the cost curve, it's plummeting rapidly. The way these things are measured is in a per kilowatt hour basis. Moore's law is fully in effect here. Technology is improving rapidly and costs are coming down. So we are now in a situation where BEV vehicles are at price parity with combustion engine vehicles and offer all of these performance advantages. All right, now last chapter. How is AI coming into the company? I just have 3 bite-sized examples here, but 3 examples that I thought you would find interesting. First, customer support. Customer support is the natural first place for AI to enter any company. You have large knowledge bases that can be fed into the AI tools. You have a lot of employees who need to master this knowledge, and you have very random arrays of questions that come in at any given time. We have implemented AI into our call centers. I just pulled the numbers for chat and email now, but we are already experimenting with voice. We have AI voice that we're turning on, calibrating, turning off. That is incredibly effective. It's hard to even know that you're talking to AI. The conversation is natural. It's hard to trip it up. But because it's still experimental, I've pulled the voice metrics out. But if you look, our inbound customer inquiries are getting more complex, more challenging, more dynamic by the day. But even with that being said, we're at now 80% of our inbound customer inquiries getting totally resolved by AI. It is doing a fantastic job. And the other thing to measure here is like, okay, well, you can do that, but if your CSAT is extremely low, then it's not a bet worth making. Our CSAT is well over 90%. So not only is AI doing it at these volumes, but it's doing it in an extremely high quality way. And we see this rate of improvement really across the board. We are hitting these inflection points where our knowledge bases are getting built out, where our employees are given the right tools, and in any department across the company, you're seeing a similar rate of improvement. Now, for the 20 or so % of tickets that we can't resolve with AI, our employees are being coached in the background with AI. So it is proactively feeding employees the information that they need. And then at the end of the day, the AI says, you know, if you had just had this one additional article in your knowledge base, you would have been more effective. I'm going to write that article for you and tell me if you want me to add it to your knowledge base. It also coaches employees at the end of the day. So it says, I've heard your conversations. You could be sharper on A, B, and C. I've created custom training curriculum for you. It will take you 12 minutes to get through it. Please take this training curriculum before you go home for the evening. So that's what it looks like in our customer support function. In the factory, AI is very much alive. In fact, we had some really remarkable, really intelligent USC interns this summer who had some cool AI deployments in the factory. One of our USC interns programmed one of these autonomous robot dogs, installed vision on this dog, and had it running around the factory to look at equipment that had just been installed and to look at machinery and to determine if there were any flaws. So the robot dog is proactively telling us if we have constructed the factory and put the equipment together correctly. So that will continue. AI and vision is quite important for the factory because it can start looking at every single vehicle that comes off the manufacturing line to spot even the smallest defects, the smallest gap imperfections, and flag those vehicles for us so that even higher quality vehicles come out of the line. Next is in the machinery. We have a reasoning model that can look at all of the machinery and how it operates as an ecosystem. And because it is understanding how one machine relates to the next, where there's a quality problem, where there's an assembly problem, it can then isolate the exact machine, the exact step in the process that is at fault and can direct us exactly to that machine for correction. And then lastly, on the planning side of the business and operations, supply and demand balancing is one of the most difficult things that we do on the sales side of the business. I mean, think of how crazy our business is. We're producing these $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 pieces of inventory. We have no idea if there's a buyer. We have no idea if it's the right product. We have no idea which market it should be going into. But we make it anyways, and we send it out there in the thousands, and we sit on this inventory. What AI allows us to do is now get a complete picture of the demand side of the equation. So that's both how are people coming to our website? What are they clicking on? What are they reserving? What are our customers telling us? Plus the macro picture. What's happening at the national level? What's happening at the market level? Are new incentives being introduced? What are utilities doing? What is the cost of charging? What is this one neighborhood doing? So we can have a very clear picture of the demand side of the equation on the one hand. On the other hand, we can know fully all of these thousands of data points on the supply side of the equation. We can understand what's happening at the factory, what they can build. We can know what our supply chain is doing. We can understand when there's supply chain disruption or shortage. And then we can match these things and into this optimization model. So we can know exactly which products to produce. We can know which have the highest margins. And we can know where to send these products. So my shorthand way of saying it, in this AI-enabled S&OP process, we can produce the right car at the right time for the right customer and the right market. And that's something that really in a pre-AI environment was never possible. There's just too much data, too much complexity, too many dependencies for any one human brain or any one Excel sheet to understand it. So those are my three quick examples of AI and the company. And I just have one more slide. Commercial operations, it's all about how we sell and service vehicles, which makes me inherently a car salesman. So I gotta sell you something before I leave. So I'm gonna leave you with a commercial, but I very intentionally picked this one commercial. It's quite special to us because it was filmed here. There's no actors in this commercial. These are all residents of Blythewood in Richland County, and really, I think, shows how our plant comes to life over the next few years. So here we go.
Before you go, have a great day.
Have a great day, Dad.
Oh, thanks, Bo.
Scout Motors is ramping up construction on its production center in Blythewood, bringing over 4,000 jobs to South Carolina.
Have a great day. Have a great day. We counting on you.
Go, get to work.
South Carolina's behind you. We're rooting for you.
Blythewood's got you. Blythewood's with you.
Have a great day.
It's gonna be a great day.
Optimism, neighborliness. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's optimism, neighborliness. Let's make things in America again. That's my story. Thank you very much for having me today. Yeah.
Thank you, Cody. I think everyone here needs to go buy a Scout, right? All right, everyone. Now we are going to take a brief refreshment break. Please stand, stretch your muscles, get a refreshment, and then come back in here. We will start our afternoon programming at 2:15. Thank you. All right. If folks will come back in, we're going to get started. Please go ahead and take your seats so that we can get started with the second half of our program. So far in our program today, we have largely focused on the short run economic outlook for 2026, the next stages of Scout Motors' investment in South Carolina. But now we want to transition and think more about the long run outlook for our state and some of the broader economic shifts that will affect us in the years to come. And perhaps nothing will be more transformative than the incorporation of AI into the workplace. As I mentioned earlier, we hear a lot about a potential jobs Armageddon. Now that's certainly a provocative headline, but is there any truth to it? I'm excited to be able to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Laura Ulrich, who will speak to how AI is currently transforming the workplace and what we're likely to see over the next several years. Laura is Director of Economic Research in North America at the Indeed Hiring Lab. Prior to joining Indeed, Laura served as a Senior Regional Economist and Senior Manager at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, primarily focused on research related to higher education and workforce dynamics. And for more than a decade, she was an economics professor and associate dean for undergraduate programs at Winthrop University. Her research interests include higher education, community college policy, labor participation, and the economic impact of local development. She holds a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Georgia and a master's and doctorate in economics from the University of Tennessee. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Laura Ulrich.
Hi there, really happy to be here today to talk to you. Happy to see some familiar faces and some new ones too. So I am going to jump right in because we got a lot to talk about here. I'm going to talk about both the national and regional labor market outlook, what we're seeing in our data at Indeed, which is very unique. I'll talk about that a bit, and then as Sarah mentioned, I'll talk some about AI. What are we seeing in the labor market? Joey talked about this, but there's definitely been a slowing in the labor market in 2025. We've seen this over time, and if you look at the average number of jobs we added per month in this post-pandemic world, we started with just a boom in employment, but a lot of this was about replacing the jobs or refilling the jobs that we lost during the actual pandemic. But then job growth remained extremely strong really until 2025, where we've seen a significant fall off, and we have been below in some months what we call like the replacement rate. So we have been at a place where we're adding, the number of jobs we're adding each month is low enough to where we've seen unemployment rates come up a little bit. When we look at our Indeed data, Indeed has both data on the labor demand and labor supply. Labor demand, we look at job postings. There's multiple ways we get data on job postings. We have the vast majority of all jobs in the country in our data set, either because somebody has paid to put their job on Indeed to hire directly through the platform, or Indeed has scraped it from other job sites. So we scrape just about every place a job would be on the internet, and so we have a very rich data set in terms of jobs. On the labor demand side, supply side, we have resumes, or what we call job seeker profiles. We have hundreds of millions of people where we can look at the composition of those individuals and how they're searching for jobs. And so we use this data on the labor demand side to create what we call the job postings index. That's what you're seeing right here. We normalize it to 100 right before COVID hits. And so you can see what job postings levels have looked like since 2020. And as of December 5th, we update our data once a week. So if you go to hiringlab.org, you can see our data at any time. We update it once a week, so it's much more frequently updated than a lot of the government data are updated and more timely. And as of December 5th, our job posting index was 104.9. What that means is that there were 4.9% more job postings than there were before COVID. Now we have seen this come down a lot. You'll see very recently it has gone up. I'm going to put a little caveat on that positive news, which is we are seeing some interesting seasonal patterns this year. We do seasonally adjust our data, but this year, for some reason, we are seeing an outsized number of seasonal jobs in driving and loading and stocking, and it looks like to us that some companies have shifted their hiring right now from permanent placement to short-term seasonal roles, and so that's kind of breaking our seasonal adjustments a little bit. So we'll see what happens if that increase is sustainable. But still, I always want to remind people that the labor market right before COVID was a strong labor market. So we were at a place at that point where unemployment rates were actually like at 40-year highs, or maybe even 60-year lows. And so we were in a really tight, very strong labor market. So the fact that we're kind of going back down to where we were before is not horrible news, although it does show this just consistent cooling off of the labor market. So we have a number of sectors that we look at. We look at 57 sectors across the country, across the labor market. These are occupational sectors. So basically 57 different types of jobs that people work in, and a slight majority of those remain above that pre-pandemic level. The rest are below. And as Joey talked about, there is a real bifurcation in the market. You know, I have people that I talk to day in and day out that are trying to get me to categorize the labor market as very soft overall, and that is not how I would characterize it. I would characterize it that in some sectors, it is indeed quite soft. In some sectors, it's pretty darn bad. I'm going to show you a bit of that. But in other sectors, if you work in healthcare, if you work in leisure and hospitality, if you work in some types of engineering, it's still a very dynamic, very tight labor market right now. So it very, very much depends on what sector you work in. I'll also talk about, in my remarks today, about how it very much matters where your feet are planted as well. Geography matters quite a bit right now. And we can see that here on the sector side. So what you're looking at here is 5 different sectors. I actually bundled up a bunch of them to make one in healthcare. But we have healthcare, human resources, loading and stocking, production and manufacturing, and software development. And I want you to pay attention to a couple things on here because I'm going to show you this just for South Carolina in a few minutes. But what you'll notice is that healthcare is still elevated well above pre-pandemic levels. In fact, there are some parts of healthcare, especially therapy jobs, so physical therapy, occupational therapy, physician jobs, that are way higher than they were before COVID. And some of the immigration policies are really impacting the ability of companies to hire in some of those fields. And so, you know, when we hear about things about young grads not being able to find jobs right now, that is true in certain fields. I have a son who graduated with a degrees in economics and math this year, wanted to do data science. It's a terrible year to find a job in data science. I'm going to show you that data in a second, and you'll see why I've been depressed as a mother. However, as I tell reporters every day, if he had graduated with a degree in nursing or early childhood education, he would have a job. There are plenty of career paths that are still very fruitful for people when they come out of college. I have been concerned because of my interest in higher ed that the way we talk about the labor market for young people is really discouraging young people from consuming higher education. Telling people that you're going to go to college and not get a job is not super helpful, especially if that's not actually the true story. And that's kind of what we see in our data at Indeed, is that it's not true for many different types of job seekers. At the same time, though, if you want to get a job in human resources or in tech, it's a tough time to find a job. And part of that is because of the boom that you see in 2021 and 2022. Tech companies hired a tremendous number of people during this period of time. I mean, even think about something like a technology like Zoom. Before COVID, we all kind of knew what Zoom was. Maybe you had used it a few times. But then all of a sudden, 2 weeks later, we're using it for everything, right? Kids are at home using Zoom for school. We're all using it for work. So imagine how many people they had to hire to staff up for that reality, right? Then what happens? Eventually, most kids went back to school. Most workers are back in the office at least a few days a week. And so many of these companies that hired a ton of people in 21 and 22, if you look at this period right here, this is software development. And what also really boomed during that time? Human resources, which makes sense, right? Because you need HR professionals to hire all those other people you're hiring. So what we see in our data is that in many cases, the sectors that had the biggest booms during 21 and 22 are having the biggest busts now. So we very much believe that the reduction in jobs in some of these sectors is still very, very highly tied to that overhiring in 21, 22. AI is also part of the story, especially in software development. We'll get there in a minute, but I will tell you that we at Indeed do not believe it as much as a large a part of the story as many people are trying to say it is right now. So if you look at if you separate jobs out by how often they're remote, you'll see that the middle and low remote jobs have fared better than the high remote jobs. This is also heavily impacted by tech, but the jobs that are done in person, the jobs that are more technical, this would also be more health-related fields, things like that have fared better. But I also want to point out that remote work is not dead. It is stabilized right now. About 8.3% of all postings are mention remote, that it's remote or that they have flexible work arrangements. And while that has gone down from being slightly over 10% back in 21, 22, it is still well over elevated compared to what we saw before COVID when it was about 2%. We actually just did a big survey. I'm going to have a piece coming out about this soon, where we asked a bunch of Americans their preferences on where they wanted to work and how they wanted to work. And it's extremely interesting, and it really makes me believe that the conversation about remote work and return to office is not over yet. And the reason I say that is because the only demographic that prefer to work 5 days in the week in the office by over 50% is men age 55 and older. But interestingly, young people do not want to work fully remote. The younger the people, like Gen Z, they want to work hybrid. They don't really want to work fully remote, but they definitely don't want to be in an office 5 days a week. They want a hybrid environment. It is actually people around my age, mid-40s-ish, that are the most likely to want fully remote work. This is part of why the return to office plans have not gone very well, because many of the people making the decisions are in that 55 plus age group, and many of the managers who are having to implement it and hold people accountable are in my age group and are not doing a very good job with that because they don't want to. So this is a very interesting conversation. And so you know, I think this is one of the things that we're going to see continue to come up because of these different demographics. The quits rate right now, this data, we finally got new JOLTS data this week. If you're a geek economist like myself, getting new data from the BLS is all of a sudden a big luxury and very exciting. And we got quits data this week, and the quits rate is just 1.8%. This is the percentage of Americans who voluntarily left a position in October. And this is a very low number. 1.8% is low. And what people are doing is they're doing what they're calling right now job hugging. Because if you have a job, the thought of being unemployed is very scary, so people don't want to jump to another job. They're just hugging on to the one that they have. And you can see that the quits rate is especially low in sectors like financial activities, business and professional services, manufacturing. Some of those sectors that Joey mentioned are also very soft in terms of payroll employment growth. It makes sense that if you see that more people are becoming unemployed or more people are, or if you're hearing that people are having a hard time finding a job in your sector, it makes sense that you might hug onto your job a little tighter right now. So this is kind of there's not a lot of churn in the market. People aren't voluntarily losing their job, and actually they're not involuntarily losing their job very much at all either. So layoffs actually remain quite low. And let me mention for a second, I should have mentioned this before, a quits rate this low we normally see when unemployment rates are around 6.5%. So normally people start really holding onto their job when there's an elevated unemployment rate. So we're in this very unique period of time when unemployment rates on average are still quite low in terms of kind of like historical standards. Certainly below what many of us were taught was like the natural rate of unemployment, which I don't even know if that exists anymore, but below what we were taught in school that was the natural rate of unemployment. But people are still hugging onto their jobs, and layoffs remain pretty low. Now, I know that some of you are hearing me say this and saying, this makes no sense. I keep hearing about layoffs in the news. Yes, you do, and there have been some very large layoffs. Indeed, had one of our own even this summer. Many of these have been from the large tech firms. They get into the news, but one of the things I want to point out is that tech employment, even by a generous definition, is only about 5% of employment in the United States. So even though these companies are very large and you hear about them all the time, they employ a relatively low number of Americans. And so we haven't seen layoff rates go up very much at all. So this is where we get in this low hire, low fire environment. That cannot last for very long with growing GDP. Okay? If GDP is growing, then in theory, we need to be hiring people, right? We need more churn in the labor market. So it would be likely to either see something's got to kind of break here. So at some point, what we would expect to see is either companies say, we've held off long enough, we're going to start hiring again. Hiring rates pick up, quits rates pick up. We start seeing the labor market be a little more fluid, have more churn in it, and GDP continue to grow like it has, or it would be likely that that doesn't happen, GDP begins to lag and layoffs go up, unemployment rates go up. So one of those two things is likely to happen at some point. I do not have a crystal ball to be able to tell which one it is, but as Joey mentioned, there are things we can look at in the data to kind of tell us a little bit, and I'll show you some of those. This here breaks down the composition of the rise in unemployment, and I want to point out just a couple things to you. So I want to point out this yellow bar. This is new entrants into the labor force, and you can see that back in the earlier part of even 2024, these new entrants to the labor market, so these are people who have never had a job at all who are entering the labor market. These typically are very young people. They are typically people who have just graduated high school or just graduated college, and they usually make up a very small part of the unemployment rate, but it has grown substantially. This is this reality that young people are having a much harder time in the labor market. The unemployment rate for 20 to 24-year-olds, I think the last one was 9.2%. It is much higher, and it has gone up over 2 percentage points in the past year. Why is this the case? What's happening with these new entrants? Well, think about this low hire, low fire environment. I just told you there's not a lot of people being laid off. There's not a lot of people leaving their jobs, which means there's not jobs being left open at the company. At the same time, because of all the economic uncertainty that exists, companies are very hesitant to grow their their workforce right now. So there's really just not a lot of jobs being created at the bottom for new grads and new entrants to move into. So it really is driven, in my opinion, while AI is playing a role, and I will show you that, more of this difficulty for young grads is about the lack of movement in the labor market and kind of the stagnancy we're seeing. Okay, so what about South Carolina? South Carolina is doing quite well compared to other states in the country. Joey mentioned this, and I want to point out that for those of you that are old enough to remember working during the Great Recession, this looked very different during that period of time for South Carolina. I remember I started teaching at Winthrop in 2007, and I remember the first couple of years I taught there, one of the facts I would tell students was South Carolina had the second highest unemployment rate in the country at the time. I think it was Rhode Island was first, which is kind of random, but it was Rhode Island and South Carolina right up at the top that were hit the hardest during the Great Recession. But this COVID recession looked very different. South Carolina has fared quite well, as have many of the other southeastern and then also Sunbelt states kind of on the bottom third part of the United States across the country. Although that is not universally true. There are states like Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama that have not done as well as places like South Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina. But you can see that there still is a big difference by sector. But what you might remember from the when I told you to pay attention last time, like this pink line, human resources, it was below 100 for the country as a whole, but it's still well above that for South Carolina. And healthcare is up above those other sectors, but the gap is not as significant. So South Carolina has seen kind of a more robust job postings across a number of sectors. So if we look at the top sectors for jobs postings in South Carolina, here are the top 10. Let me remind you what these numbers mean. So we indexed to 100 before COVID. So if you look at 249, that tells you that the demand for physicians and surgeons, the number of job postings is 149% higher now than it was before COVID, okay? And so you can see all of these are at least 81% higher than they were before 2020, and many of them are in healthcare, but then there's also, civil engineering, accounting, but like I said, things like therapy, doctors, you see veterinary, legal, many of these require specialty schools of education, right? Especially schools that you have to go to, special licenses, many, many years of education. There's still a lot of those job postings. And we do a good bit of work at Indeed also on immigration. And one of the interesting facts we see in our data is that the number of companies, and if you look, like there is a high percentage of people in the physicians category, engineering, accounting, therapy, all of these things that are immigrants. And the percentage of companies that are offering to sponsor visas for these workers has not gone down at all. It has remained quite high. But interest from abroad, because we can see when people are searching, like if somebody lives in Chile, but they're searching for a job in Columbia, South Carolina, we can see that, right? And so the interest in people overseas for these professional levels has really declined this year because of immigration policy in the United States and kind of the fear around that. And so it is making it more difficult, and we hear that regularly from clients too, that it's making it more difficult to hire in some of these fields that rely really heavily on immigration. These are the bottom. So if you want a little humor, my middle son is in school. He would like to be a doctor, so I feel really good about that. But I mentioned my other son is a data scientist, so got one at the very bottom and one at the very top. But in data and analytics, the job postings in South Carolina, even with all the growth we've seen, are 30% below what they were before COVID. So there's been quite a fall off in that field. Childcare is also low. What is driving this? We've looked into this some. Some of this, too, is about some of the policy changes in 2025. Some of the federal government cuts have led to closings of some facilities, including Head Start in Rock Hill, where I live, and some other local government-funded programs. So we've seen a decline in childcare. But you'll notice here that many of these are in fields related to tech and media. One interesting thing, though, that I noticed in my role at the Federal Reserve, and then I wanted to, because I started at Indeed just 5 months ago from the Richmond Fed, and I've lived in Rock Hill now for 18 years, so I feel like I'm almost a South Carolinian at this point. But one of the things I noticed in my work at the Fed was that we were seeing really strong growth in these smaller to mid-size MSAs. And actually, over time, I had begun to believe that one of the reasons why South Carolina has grown so much in this post-COVID era is that we don't have a large MSA in the state. All the MSAs that we have, all the metro areas we have are small to mid-size. We don't have a Chicago, a New York, right, or even something like a Charlotte. And so I did an analysis very recently to look at the job postings by MSA, and there's a really interesting pattern that emerges. In almost every state in the country, the stronger job growth or job postings are actually happening in the smaller MSA. Somebody asked about Greenwood earlier. Somebody over here, I think. Like Greenwood, I just looked it up, is up 45% compared to pre-COVID. And Greenwood has grown, but it has not grown by 45%. So if you look at South Carolina is at about 30% above pre-COVID levels in terms of job postings, but has only had population growth around 7%. So that's really impressive, right? You've got 30% more jobs being posted with only 7% growth. So that's great. That's a positive thing, right? But it also represents a challenge because you have to provide those companies with the skilled workforce that they need, or they'll go somewhere else, right? So we have to think about how we train workers, how we encourage young people to get training. And actually, we see this all across the country. So if you look at South Carolina, for example, you'll see a lot of very dark blue, but you'll see one lighter blue area. That's actually the Charlotte MSA, the part that's in South Carolina where I live. In Charlotte, the job postings are only about 10% higher right now than they were before COVID. But in Columbia, for example, they're 36% higher than they were before COVID. And we're seeing this all across the country. And why is this? This is a post-COVID migration story where people have been moving to smaller MSAs, to mid-sized MSAs from the largest places. It's also a story about affordability. If you want to move your family somewhere and want to buy a home, for example, some of the large MSAs have become extraordinarily expensive. And as I try to explain to people when I'm in South Carolina sometimes, the cost of housing, yes, it has gone up a ton in places like Greenville and Charleston and Columbia, but it is still relatively affordable to much of the country, which is hard for people to believe sometimes because the prices have gone up so much. But if you look at migration patterns, you'll see that some of the places people are moving from, the migration patterns are like Miami to this area, or San Diego to this area, or Fairfax, Virginia to this area. I did analysis for Greenville recently, and Honolulu, Hawaii was the 10th most common county that people were moving from to Greenville, South Carolina. Honolulu. Well, if you move from Honolulu to Greenville, you could buy 5 houses with cash, right, for what you sold your house for. So it seems like a real bargain. But this is interesting, and I think this will continue because part of this, and I really appreciated the presentation for Scout Motors. If you've driven by that site, if you look at the economic development that's come into the state of South Carolina and North Carolina over the past 5 years, much of it has been in the EV space, much of it. Much of it requires large mega sites, and you cannot locate a large mega site in a really large MSA, right? You have to go out into these counties. So you have to build it somewhere like Blythewood, or if you're Toyota, their large battery plant in North Carolina is in Chatham County, North Carolina. You have to go into these kind of exurbs or more rural locations. So let's talk quickly about the impact of AI. Tech jobs are in a recession. There are other fields too. Economics is in a terrible spot right now because federal government's a large hirer of econ PhDs. Academia is a large hirer of economics PhDs. That has really slowed down. So there are fields where it is a very hard time to find a job right now. And tech is certainly part of that. But one of the things I want to point out to you, and we're going to have some pieces come out in early 2026. So if you don't follow me on LinkedIn already, please follow me so you can see them when we release them. But we've done some new work on top of this to really show that actually The real bust for tech happened before ChatGPT was even released. So if we look at kind of the post-AI, once AI was really starting to be used in the labor force, we really see kind of a flattening out of what's happened in tech. So while we do believe AI is disrupting certain jobs within tech, we believe most of the bust was about this overhiring period earlier a few years ago, but we'll have more to say about that soon. However, let me point this out to you. So let me tell you what you're looking at here. This is tech jobs. This is log change in tech job postings. Just think of this as like how much job postings have gone up or down. This is the median annual posted salary. So you're about to maybe be depressed about your salary compared to some of these tech workers. I know I am. But if you look, so this is $100,000 a year. This is 200. And if you look at the jobs that have seen the largest decline over this period of time, they are what we would consider entry to mid-level tech jobs. And if you look at the titles, if you were able to see them, I know they're tiny, you would see that most of them have the word developer or analyst in the title. These are entry-level jobs. This is work that AI is pretty good at. So companies, they're not able to replace all their developers with AI, but they are able to hire fewer developers who then can leverage AI to still produce the same amount of work. But at the same time, we've seen some jobs that have grown a lot. Many of these are higher income jobs, right? These tend to be in the $175,000 to $300,000 a year range. And these are things like SAP consultant, Oracle consultant, technology lead. One really interesting one here that's grown a lot, data center technician. That is tied to AI, right? It's not highlighted as one of the dots, but all the jobs related to cybersecurity are up. That's a job that you probably don't want AI doing your cybersecurity. That would be a really bad idea right now. Don't do that. But these entry-level tech jobs, yes, that is where you would introduce AI technology first, so that makes sense. I think one of the things that we've seen in our research is that while these entry-level jobs are declining, senior-level jobs are increasing, but it is not clear going forward with AI technology how we then train junior-level people to become senior-level people, right? If the junior-level jobs, if the funnel becomes much narrower at the top, how do you get the same number of senior level professionals down the road? We don't quite know that yet. But let me make one other statement before I show you the next thing on skills. We track what percentage of job postings mention AI at all. So either you're building AI, you're using AI, you're looking at AI, whatever, mention it at all, and it's still 4%. It's 4%. So it is higher in tech jobs, but it's still just 4%. So there still is not, and that includes how job postings discuss skills that are needed, anything at all, any relation to AI. And when we look at it, the jobs that actually say you need to be AI fluent as a skill is very, very low, around 1%. So still pretty low take up from companies in general in terms of how they describe the skills that workers need. So we do believe as a team that AI will transform the way we all work. It's transformed the way I work on a daily basis already, but we don't really believe that AI is displacing a lot of workers yet. That being said, we have a skills taxonomy of 2,900 skills where we can look and see how many of those skills we actually use AI. We've done this 2 years in a row. We use AI to see how many of these 2,900 skills AI can do by itself. And how much can AI do with like a little bit of human help versus it can't do it at all. A year ago when we did this, AI could not do any of the 2,900 skills that are typically found on job descriptions by itself. This year, it could do 1%. It was 19 skills. And the skills that AI could do alone were things like basic math, basic grammar, and transcription. That basically, and translation, language translation. Those were kind of the basic skills that it could do alone. But what is interesting is 40% of the 2,900 skills could be done with just a little bit of human assistance. So a human directing AI what to do, writing the prompts and directing it casually. But at the same time, there was another 40% of the skills that AI really couldn't do at all. So what this does is this creates a very a very strong, like a very, let me say, like kind of bimodal distribution in terms of how certain fields or how certain jobs are going to be impacted by AI. So I know this is probably pretty hard to see, but on the left here, you have nursing, and on the right, you have software development. The bigger the bubble, the more frequently the skill is mentioned in a job posting or description. The blue is AI can do it. The gray is it can't. So in nursing, there are some skills that AI can do for nurses, communication, administrative work, but it can't do patient care. And so nursing is not likely to be disrupted in major ways, although it will change a nurse's job in some ways. I know I just went to the doctor the other day, and they had me sign this thing saying, basically, there's an AI that's listening to this room and will write up notes after, right? That's pretty new. I think that's pretty brand new. So it is changing medicine, and that is part of patient care, but still the nurse is needed in the room to do all the patient care skill. And in some ways, it might improve the patient care skill, right? Because they're not having to worry about taking notes while they're also doing patient care. That, though, can be compared to software development, where all the major skills can be done by AI, not alone, but with minimal help. And the only thing it can't do is organizational leadership. So software development, much more likely to be heavily impacted by AI. I will tell you, though, it's easy to think about tech jobs with AI, but two of the fields that's very relevant to this group that are at the very top. So we have data and analytics as number one in terms of sectors that will be disrupted. Software development two. Number three is accounting, and number four is marketing. So there are business fields that also have a very high level of transformation with AI. And what we find overall in this work this year is basically about 25% of jobs are exposed to high potential for Gen AI transformation. I say potential because the technology is continuing to develop, right? So none of us really know today what it's going to look like next year. One of the big questions I have is, last year, AI could do 0 of the 2,900 skills itself. This year, it could do 19. In 2026, is it 38 or is it 624? Right? Is it a linear transformation or is it an exponential transformation? Because whether it's linear or exponential is going to, that difference will have very serious differential impacts on the labor market. So, I'll say again that even though we do believe that there will be this transformation, we are not seeing, I am constantly being asked, I bet on an average day I get 5 requests from the media or external individuals who are asking about like how many jobs are already being basically like destroyed by AI, and we believe that number is very low at this point. There are clearly some jobs that AI is able to do, but those are very, very limited at this moment. Okay. A general economic outlook, I wanted to show you our economic scenarios for 2026. And in some ways, it's just kind of almost a continuation of what we saw this year. Much of the economic uncertainty that we entered into 2025 with, we still have in 2026. Early in 2025, people worried about tariffs. We're still worried about those impacts with inflation. People worried about immigration. We're still worried about the impacts of immigration. People were worried about inflation. We're still worried about inflation. So we're not expecting a really significant deterioration, but we do expect unemployment rates to tick up just a little bit and probably end up somewhere between 4.1 to 4.8, but more in the 4.4 to 4.5 range, which would give us a job openings rate of somewhere between about 6.8 million and 7.4 million. But there's a lot of uncertainty baked into this. And we do think that part of this is highly dependent on what happens to healthcare jobs this next year. The reason we believe this is because if you look at the number of jobs added in healthcare, it basically makes up the entire number of jobs that were added in the United States this year. If you then compare, take out the declines. Healthcare growth has been propping up the rest of the labor market in serious ways. This isn't too surprising because baby boomers are aging. We knew this was going to happen. If you looked on the BLS website 15 years ago about the fastest growing jobs in 15 years, it would have been a lot of healthcare jobs. But one thing that I think we didn't know at that time was how wealthy baby boomers were going to be and how high their taste for healthcare was going to be. So they're consuming even more healthcare than expected, but we're not training people fast enough to do those jobs. And healthcare is one of those sectors, right, where you just can't snap your fingers and be a healthcare worker in most fields tomorrow. And if I am a healthcare worker, you should report someone. I should never be a healthcare worker, right? There are certain people who are not meant to work in healthcare. I am one of them. So we also don't all need to become healthcare workers. So this isn't just an easy substitution between sectors. There are efforts all around the place. Charlotte just built a medical school. There are PT schools opening, pharmacy schools opening, but we're not training them fast enough. And the new student loan restrictions on borrowing will significantly hit those healthcare programs. So if you're not aware of that, you probably should be if you're interested in higher ed or healthcare. And so it's going to be interesting to watch in the next couple of years what happens in the healthcare hiring sector. So if the healthcare sector keeps humming along, keeps adding jobs, we could be in a situation where, like I said, that carries us through to the point where other firms start hiring and we just see a better churn in the labor market. But if healthcare gets jobs become restricted or decline, or if labor supply becomes too tight, we could see more problems. Also, the Fed has a really tough job going forward. When I used to work at the Fed, I wouldn't have been able to talk about this today. I would have been in blackout still, but now I can talk about it. So if you look, yesterday was really interesting because there were 3 ways different FOMC members voted yesterday, which is highly unusual. So the majority voted to cut rates by 25 basis points. One person voted to cut them by 50 basis points, but 2 voted not to cut at all. And if you look at the projections for 2026 that they released yesterday, the median FOMC participant is just expecting 1 additional cut next year. So what they're signaling is they're almost done. Like, this is where we're going to be. And part of that is because inflation is still stubbornly well above the 2% target. So if inflation continues to climb the way it has, I mean, it's not climbing at large amounts like Joey said, but it is just kind of stubbornly high, which, by the way, if you took economics 102 or whatever it was called, where you took macro, you learned prices are sticky, right? Once prices go up, they like to stay up. They like to go up even further from year to year, right? So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in that regard. But the labor market is in a tenuous place too because of this balance I talked about. So the Fed is going to have a really tough job going forward. And there are upside and downside risks. One upside risk is the tax cuts and deregulation that will happen in 2026. There have been things like the tax bill that went through. They cut or they went back to the old emission standards for cars recently. There've been a pattern of deregulation that could mean higher economic growth and higher demand for workers, but still the uncertainty related to tariffs and immigration are really slowing down the market, specifically tariffs still. And so there's it will be, if you run a company, and humans run companies, right? And when people are uncertain, it's very hard for them to decide how much do I order today if I don't know what the price is today, or how much am I going to order up 30 days from now if I don't know what that price is going to be. And so it's not only the threat of tariffs, but it's also the moving back and forth on tariffs that creates more and more uncertainty. Same thing for immigration, especially in certain fields that rely very heavily on immigration. So this would, there's kind of groups on the top and bottom income distribution in terms of like lots of leisure and hospitality jobs, construction jobs, landscape jobs, agriculture jobs are held by immigrants, but also many jobs in medicine and the sciences, engineering are held by immigrants. So here is our website, hiringlab.org. You can keep up with our research there. Also find me on LinkedIn. I post much of it there. We also have a data portal on Hiring Lab where you can sort by sector, sort by geography, and see what things look like in your region. And I think I can take maybe a question or two. We'll have Q&A after as well. Mm-hmm.
One, demanded profession, why is it so hard to get into med school?
This is great question. I've got a child who's pre-med, and I'm like worried so much about his biology grade right now that because it's so hard to get in, right? You almost demand like perfection to get in. One of the things that we don't talk about a lot in higher ed that I talk about a lot is how we fund higher ed. And if you look at a lot of high demand programs, so this includes also health programs, like think about it at like Midlands Tech. So you've got programs like dental hygiene. York Tech, where I live, just closed their dental hygiene wait list because it's like 4 to 5 years long. And people were getting so discouraged by this wait list that they just closed it down. So the question might be like, why don't we add more students to this dental hygiene program? Well, if you've ever visited a dental hygiene lab, which you probably haven't, they have these fake heads with real teeth. And those things cost $35,000 a head. And you can only clean those teeth so many times before you need to buy more. And they have rows of them. They're very expensive. But we fund education by full-time enrolled students, so we're funding that classroom at the same level that we're funding an economics classroom, where the equipment I require is a whiteboard and a marker. So the way we fund education simply does not encourage the expansion and growth of high-demand, expensive programs. And so if you look at how colleges decide they want to expand some of these programs, but the faculty are very expensive, right? It's very expensive to get med school faculty. You've got to find residency spots for these people. They've got to have clinical spots. It's just much more complicated than it seems like it should be. But in my opinion, as an economist who studied this a lot, it all goes to the funding of it. If we funded it differently based on demand or based on how expensive they are, we could have a model that looked very different. Yeah. Okay, one more and then I'll switch. Yeah, she's asking about the shortage of teachers. It's actually gotten a little better. In South Carolina, it's gotten a lot better because many places have increased wages. And so that is working. Also, South Carolina this past year added education to the list of fields where students can get the supplement for the life scholarship, so you can get more scholarship money from the state if you're an education major. So there's been some positive movement, I think, in the state to encourage more teachers. It's a hard job. Many of the jobs where there are shortages are jobs that are very physically taxing. And so it's one of those things where many people get the training and go into it but don't last very long, and we see that in many jobs that are very physical and maybe don't have the flexibility. Like teachers have flexibility in the summer, but during the workday, it's very inflexible, right? And so people's desire for flexibility is moving them away from education. It's something that I think we'll continue to struggle with unless we can figure out how to fix some of those complications. But yeah, it's been a very serious issue nationally, but it is getting better. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Ulrich. That was fascinating. All right, as we continue to consider some of the broader shifts likely to affect our economy in the coming years, we also have to consider policy changes, something that we haven't touched on yet today, both monetary and fiscal policy. For example, how will Federal Reserve policy likely unfold next year? What does that mean for interest rates? And does the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill have any significant implications for an investment-driven economy like South Carolina? To answer those questions is our final speaker of the day, Dr. Doug Woodward. As most of you know, Dr. Woodward is the director of the Division of Research here at the Moore School and has been a professor of economics at USC, studying South Carolina's economy for almost 39 years. He has also taught and conducted economic research all over the world and has published extensively in the fields of regional economics, firm location, urban and industrial clustering, and foreign direct investment. He has testified before local, state, and national government committees and has even presented his research at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Dr. Woodward earned his PhD at the University of Texas at Austin in 1986. He joined the University of South Carolina faculty in 1987. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Doug Woodward.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Sarah. Is the sun still shining out there? Because I think in all my 38 years here in South Carolina, we just went through the gloomiest period I've ever seen. And if this lasted 2 more weeks, I was ready to go to Hawaii. Okay, I was going to start that migration back that way. Okay. Well, what I want to do, and first I want to just say something about Laura, and I'm so happy you came here today and presented this very useful information for us, because we as economists largely rely on government data. And there's been a lot of problems with government data lately. You've probably heard about that with the Bureau of Labor Statistics and big controversy with the president not happy with those data, and then we had the government shutdown. So it's been difficult for us to get current information. So we're very happy to have Laura's insights, because this is granular, really up-to-date information that you can't get anywhere else on really what, it really puts our finger on the pulse of what's happening with the job market there. So thank you very much for that. And I'm sure we're going to get more questions. We're going to have a time for questions after my hopefully brief remarks. It won't be too long, I promise. But I do want to summarize what we've been doing today, talking about so far, and add to that some issues or opportunities and challenges that we face in this state in the coming year. So what I want to do is I want to first characterize our economy as a K-shaped economy. Maybe you've heard about that, but that's going to get back to some of the uncertainty and also the imbalances that we all feel that's in our economy these days. And it has to do with the haves and the have-nots. Some people are doing extremely well, some people not so well. And I want to emphasize why that is the case in my talk today. I also want to talk about, we haven't talked a lot about that today, Federal Reserve monetary policy. We just saw a big announcement last year. Coming forward this year, there's going to be a big change in our central bank. We're going to have a new chair that's going to come in May. That's going to be appointed by a president. And you know, that's very much in the news as who that's going to be. Is it going to be dovish? Is it going to be hawkish? A lot of other appointments would be made in the Federal Reserve. So we're going to have a whole new kind of monetary policy regime coming in, and I want to address that and the challenges that they face and the dilemmas that they face at the Federal Reserve and how that affects South Carolina. And then finally, I want to talk about, remember this, the big, beautiful bill, right? That's just going to kick in. It's kicking in now, and it's going to have an impact on the U.S. as well as on our South Carolina economy, especially in the area of investment. So I want to address that big issue. So first, the K-shaped economy. What is that? Like I said, that has to do with the haves and the have-nots. But who are they? Who are the haves? Those are the people who have accumulated wealth, especially since 2020, since the pandemic. This was a big surprise to me that after the pandemic, we'd see this big surge in wealth. And wealth I'm talking about, the stock market, of course, we all know about that. Housing prices, that's also part of wealth, but also new forms of wealth creation like crypto. All of these things have been growing very rapidly. Even recently, gold, as you've seen, has been up a lot. People who hold this wealth are the ones that are in good shape. Those are the haves, and I'll come back to that. Those are don't have it, the have-nots, don't have wealth. I'm not saying they don't have anything. They have a lot. They might have a job. They might have a good job. But they feel nervous and they're not gaining from this wealth accumulation. And they're feeling this affordability crisis because part of that has to do with housing. People have their housing, it's appreciating, you're feeling good. If not, it's an affordability crisis. So I also want to address the uneven impact of inflation on different groups. And this affects South Carolina as well as the U.S. So to start, let's talk about the upper arm of the K, the one that's done very well, especially since the pandemic. Saw big gains in assets. That's the top 20% of all households in the United States. They hold about 75% of the wealth. So of course they're feeling good, especially as we see these bubbles forming and they're benefiting from it. They're the top 20%. Also, recently, they're spending more. They've been holding in 2025. They really spent a lot, okay, feeling good. It's the rest of the economy not feeling so good, and they've been curtailing their spending. Usually the top 20% isn't spending up to 50% of all the spending, but that's upticked recently. So what's the lower part of the K? And I don't want to say they're going down, but they're the bedrock. They're holding this whole economy up. They're the wage earners. When I say have-nots, again, I'm talking about people who have not wealth, or not significant amounts of wealth. They might have jobs, they're earning wages, but as Joey was pointing out, the wages haven't been keeping up with inflation, although recently that's been reversed a little bit. Now real wages are going up, but it's still going to take till, 2028 for them to catch up where they were just a few years ago. And those are the ones that are feeling anxious. And the other ones I want to mention too, not just the wage earners, there's a lot of people in our economy that are not in the so-called working class. They're on fixed income. They might be on Social Security. They might be on disability benefits, and they're not benefiting from wealth either. They're also part of, I want to emphasize when I say have-nots, it's not that they don't have anything, they just don't have what has really been booming lately, and that has been assets. These are the consumers that are most hurt by inflation and the most ones concerned about high housing costs. So we got two different kinds of groups. 80% are in these have-nots without a significant amount of wealth, 20% feeling great because they have this wealth. So how did this happen? How did we get to this point? Well, there's a lot of reasons, of course, but I want to emphasize one. Laura used to work at the Federal Reserve. I'm going to come back to that. We created this everything bubble in the 2020s. Housing, stock market, now we got crypto. Maybe that bubble has burst, but we'll see. But definitely not the stock market. Isn't it somewhat surprising, given all this uncertainty about the economy? Why does it? We have stock market evaluations now that rival, what happened in 1999 and 2000, just before the dot-com bubble. Now we've got price-earnings ratios on stocks, which is one way of measuring whether we're in a bubble, that are reaching historic highs. And so you could either be benefiting from that or you could be feeling the pain from that. But here's the reason why I think this has happened. This isn't the only reason, but it largely has to do with what the Federal Reserve did after the pandemic. They call it liquidity. They started printing money like we never saw before. This is shown on this chart here. This is the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, but really what it represents is $5 trillion more of liquidity. And if you want in the question and answer, I can define that for you, but it's bank reserves and it's other forms of, eventually it ends up in money and creating more money in the economy that didn't exist before, because the Federal Reserve can do that out of thin air. They do it on a computer. They don't actually print it. But that's what's shown here, right here, is that, see how we never saw anything like that in history. It's like they wanted to throw this liquidity into the economy to kill the virus. What it did is it led to a potential, and eventually did, inflationary phenomenon, but it also, when we talk about inflation, we're not just talking about inflation on goods and services, and this is what we've been addressing so far, but inflation of assets. That's where, when this money gets created, it first goes through the banking system into assets. And that's why we started seeing the stock market boom, and we started seeing housing start to go up as well. So this is the cause. Okay, and this is why the Federal Reserve is still trying to deal with it. Now, they've been tapering lately. They're not doing, this was called quantitative easing, this policy that they put in place. It actually went back to the great financial crisis in 2008. Our South Carolina native Ben Bernanke was chair of the Federal Reserve at that time, and he and a former economic professor came up with this policy. He even admitted he didn't know exactly why it worked, but they did it anyways, and they saw assets start to bloat up. And then they did it, really, they just blew it out after the pandemic. Now they're trying to bring that back down. They're trying to withdraw. That's why you see it going down there at the end towards recent. So they're not engaged in this policy anymore. But that created huge distortions in our economy, because we're talking about trillions of dollars of new liquidity that was pumped in and eventually found its way into the asset markets. The other thing the Federal Reserve did that really is just unprecedented, and this has also bloated up assets, especially housing prices, as you can see towards the end of the graph there on the right side, we had a zero interest rate policy. We never had that before in history. And, then we say, well, what are the consequences? We're living with the consequences of that right now. Now we're seeing, as we know, rates go up, but that's been causing a lot of pain. So the Federal Reserve is looking at now, trying to find a way to reduce borrowing costs, reduce rates. That's what they did yesterday. They reduced by 25 basis points. This is the rate that the Federal Reserve caused. They don't control all interest rates. So let me be clear about that. They control this rate. This is called the Fed funds rate. It's a very short-term, three-month term interest rate. Do they have control over all interest rates? The interest rates that matter to us are the longer-term interest rates, the 10-year Treasury bond, the mortgage rates, and so forth. But this is one of the games they've been playing is, when I studied economics many years ago, we were taught that the Federal Reserve should keep a steady control of the money supply to not create all this volatility and uncertainty. But apparently that's not the theory that they follow anymore. And you can see what's happened also with mortgage rates. Now, this is something that other people have felt too as a result of these policies, is that mortgage rates were, everybody knows, at historic lows. But think of what a distortion that put in the housing market. People are holding on to their homes because they've got interest rates that they'll never see again. And so they want to hold on to those homes. And now we're seeing interest rates, these are long-term rates, rise. And even with the lowering of these short-term rates that I just showed you before, it's not having much effect on mortgage rates. And that might be the same in long-term interest rates generally, the same case next year. So everybody's hoping, including our president, is we got to get a Federal Reserve in here to drive these interest rates down. Everyone's going to benefit from this. And everything's going to be good again. But it's not clear that's actually the case because the Federal Reserve doesn't have complete control over the long-term interest rates. That has to do with other market forces. And it also has to do with what they did before, called quantitative easing, what I showed you in the previous chart, when they're pumping all this money in to the economy, that they were buying up. Well, when they create this money, what they do is they buy long-term Treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. That's primarily what they're doing. The mortgage-backed security, they're buying up a lot of, I guess you could say, mortgages, and that was driving down mortgage interest rates. This is going back after the pandemic. It's not clear they're going to do that anymore because of all the distortions that already, so I don't know if they have that tool going forward into 2026. So here's what I do see for Federal Reserve policy. We're going to see some more short-term rate cuts, especially with the new Federal Reserve regime coming in. They did it yesterday. Chairman Powell said we might see a couple more going into 2026. No more of this bond buying, they call it yield curve control over the long-term interest rates. Might not happen, but the short-term rates will probably continue to go down. There is this inflation risk. This is the dilemma that they face. So is this what our president really wants? He wants rates down, but how is that going to solve the inflation problem? If anything, it's only going to make it worse. And also, we don't know what's going to happen with long-term rates. It's still very uncertain. That's the rate. Those are the rates that really kind of matter to most people. And if there's continued worry about inflation, there's going to be an inflation premium on the long-term rates because you're holding those bonds for a long time, and they could be eroded by inflation. So rates could actually. Well, I'm not actually predicting this, but I'm saying it's a possibility that long-term rates could even go up even as the Federal Reserve becomes very loose. So this is the problem that we face. And I don't think another big stimulus like we saw before, the QE, the quantitative easing, that's a convoluted term, but this is what they do to control the long-term rates that I already talked about. But that's primarily good for assets, but that's what's creating the bubble. The big concern is going to be what if the stock market does crash? There's a lot of reasons why it could. That's going to affect that 20%. Then their consumption is going to go down, and it can drag the whole economy down with it. So we really got to pay attention next year to the stock market, I'm telling you, and then how the Federal Reserve reacts to that. So what will boost? Now we're talking about monetary policy, the Federal Reserve, always in the news every day, people following it. What will boost GDP in 2026? Probably not much in terms of monetary policy. But we haven't really had a wide discussion about the big, beautiful bill that was passed, and then with all the noise and everything else going on in the economy, and of course the tariffs, everybody's focused on that. But we passed this bill, and there was a lot in that that affects the consumer, it affects business spending, or government spending, and in particular, one thing I want to emphasize, it affects real business investment. And that's what's important to our state, because we're an investment-oriented state. And there's a lot in that big, beautiful bill that is very favorable for real investment, not financial investment, just wealth accumulation in the stock market. I'm talking bricks and mortar investment, the kind of thing, of course, that Scout is doing and we want to see more of. So here are the economic drivers in 2026 of GDP. You've got, and how the big, beautiful bill might affect that. It's going to affect consumption because it locked in the 2017 tax cuts. I'll come back to that. It's going to affect investment. Not the big, this is why I have different, the arrows are different widths, because consumption is 2/3 of our economy. So that affecting consumption, that's the most important. But investment, maybe 15% of our GDP, that's what drives future growth. That's what Scout Motors is doing. That's what we want to see more of. So that's critical. And that's what this bill is really oriented towards. And finally, it expands government spending, because we never stop that. So let me first talk about the consumption effects just briefly. This bill locks in many of the tax cuts originally proposed in the 2017 tax law. Now think of what would happen next year if that bill last year wasn't passed. We'd all be facing, pretty much everyone, a big tax increase. So that's not happening. So that's going to help that consumption. That creates a little bit more certainty about that big sector of our GDP, the consumption sector. It lowers taxes for individuals and families really across all income levels. So that's locked in now. That's a positive. Then there's government spending. Like I said, large increases, big increases in defense. For the first time ever, $1 trillion that's going to be the Pentagon's budget. When I first started, we used to think in billions. Now we have to think in trillions. Everything's trillions. How much is a trillion, by the way? It's a million? All right? That's what we're talking about. A million, okay? That's how much the Pentagon is getting in spending. And a lot of other government spending is coming in. And that's very stimulative. We're not in an austerity period. We're still, we're in deficit spending, and the deficit is still growing. We did nothing to solve that. But short term, in 2026, that's good, because that's a lot more spending coming in from the government. That's going to kick in. We're going to feel it here in South Carolina, because we've got a big defense industry, as we know, and a lot of other businesses tied to it. So that's a positive for us, at least in the short term. And also increases in energy and in infrastructure projects, which I'm going to come back to, that we sorely need. So big bit of, here's where the real trillions are, okay? It's an investment. This is where Trump got up and said there's going to be $20 trillion of new investment coming into our economy. Maybe you've seen, he brings in CEOs and people, and they stand behind him, and they all promise, oh, we're going to put in trillion. And while they're standing, they said, no, maybe we'll put in 1.2 trillion. So a lot of that's just, it's just, you can ignore it. But even if we got 10% of that, 2% of that, we're still talking about a lot of investment that's going to be stimulated by the big, beautiful bill. Part of that, we've heard about these, when we talk about these big numbers, is going into data centers. Maybe in the Q&A we can talk about that. There's going to be a lot of, we know, investment in data centers to support this AI. And a lot of this is commitments. Some of it's being built even here in South Carolina. But this kind of investment in the data centers is not job generating. All right, it might generate some taxes, some property taxes, but it isn't going to generate many jobs. It's not like a Scout Motors kind of investment, I guarantee. We might need it for AI, but in South Carolina, how are we going to benefit from that? Most of the gains from all this AI and investment in AI by OpenAI, by Google now, and many others. Of course, Tesla is doing it as well, building data centers. Most of the benefits of that are going to go to that top 20%. It's not going to go to the broad base of the economy. It's going to be going to the wealthy. They're going to see their stock prices continue to go up. They're going to continue to see most of the gains, not much in terms of what's going to filter down into the rest of the economy, wage earners and so forth. I'm not saying we don't need these, but so when you hear a lot of the investment I'm talking about, the big numbers, a lot of that has to do with these data centers, and they're going to be built out and continue to be the case this year. If there's one chart I want you to remember, though, and this is where we face a real challenge. This is kind of scary, and this is to build these data centers, we need electricity, right? And our electricity, that's the bottom line there. I don't know if it's clear, but that's the U.S., and the top is China. China has put in, in the last 20 years, more electricity generation than the whole world combined. We've virtually done nothing. And now we've got these data centers that are going to be data hungry. Where are we going to get the energy? We can talk about that maybe in the Q&A. But this is really scary. We just haven't been keeping up. China has more energy than it knows what to do with. It has absolutely no problem with building data centers. And they're into AI too. So they got a real competitive advantage with us right now. So energy is a big issue. It's a big issue for South Carolina. How are we going to build out our energy infrastructure? And a lot of good things are happening there, but we got a lot of catching up to do if we really seriously think we're going to be competitive in this area of AI. Now, generally the big beautiful bill, though, does lift capital investment way beyond the data centers. Here are some of the provisions in the bill. Restores 10% immediate expensing for capital investment. You see how investment-oriented it is. Companies can now deduct the full cost of qualified equipment or property in the year in which it's placed in service. This is a big tax advantage rather than depreciating over several years. That's stimulative. That's gonna help get some more real investment going. Another thing this bill does is it puts America first in terms of bringing money back, foreign income back to the United States with favorable tax treatment. All right, it increases taxes on foreign income while providing targeted incentives for U.S.-based production and export-oriented production. Okay, so that could find its way into our state. Again, we're talking about hundreds of potentially billions of dollars of investment coming back. Another thing it does, you see Scout Motors is investing in R&D, as we need more R&D for sure in our economy. This big, beautiful bill provides enhanced incentives for research and development spending in the U.S., which will encourage innovation, which we definitely clearly need more of, new products and technological advancement. So these are the kinds of things that bill is designed to do, and there's a lot more in there too. I just don't see a lot of discussion about it, but this is a positive for the U.S. and a positive for South Carolina. So this will boost South Carolina's investment, I believe, over the long term, as firms are able to capitalize on expensing and incentives, possible burst of business investment even coming this year beyond what we were already anticipating in equipment, facilities, R&D, manufacturing, defense-related activities. So that was where the real opportunities are for South Carolina. Now over here, that picture there you're seeing is, that's our Secretary of the Treasury, Besant, South Carolina native, you might know that. You know, one of the top, really, economists next to the Federal Reserve in the U.S. is a South Carolina native. So Joey remembers this, we invited him here to the Outlook Conference to come and tell us all about the big, beautiful bill and how we're going to benefit from it, but we didn't really hear back. But we did, the next month he did show up in South Carolina, and that's what I'm showing you here. Did you hear about that? He went to Sumter, one of those medium-sized cities. That's where he went. He didn't go to Greenville. He didn't go to Charlotte. He went to Sumter, South Carolina. Why? Because what does Sumter have? They have a magnet factory that's been in production. You know, magnets are something we're in critical need of because they rely on rare earth minerals, and you heard a lot about that controversy, and they're saying we don't do that in America anymore. It turns out we do. We actually do. We do build, these magnets right here in South Carolina. This is the kind of thing we need more of. So he was here touting that, as well as the big Boeing expansion. So we are seeing a lot of investment happening here in South Carolina. And I think this bill will only encourage that more. At least that's the line that they're pushing out of Washington. And I think there's a lot of reason to believe that's something that is definitely good for our state. So there's Scout. I generated I don't know if Cody's not here anymore, but I don't know if there's an accurate depiction of what that is. I had AI generate this in front of the new Finley Park. Has anyone been to that new park? Yeah, it's great, right? So Columbia, right? Columbia, yeah, I say. But so that's that investment. We need more of this, but we want it made in South Carolina. Of course, we want more made in South Carolina, but there's some big challenges. I will go into it in the details. But let me mention one thing. Cody didn't touch on this, but the big challenge for the EVs right now is batteries, right? We had a big battery production facility that was being built out in Florence, shut down last year. All right, we've got to, why is it doing it? Because that battery factory looked like it was owned by the Japanese, but it turns out it's actually owned by the Chinese, because the Chinese have all the technology. They're making huge advances in batteries. We're not even close. You can't have EVs without Chinese batteries or Chinese technology. And so because of the tariffs that they put on imported parts, not just the final goods, the final cars, but the parts that go into those cars, especially on China, the huge tariffs, it created a lot. They couldn't do it, is my understanding, because there was basically going to be still Chinese primarily. So we got to be concerned about the supply chain and the EV industry, and Cody didn't address that, but it really has to do with batteries. So there are still some major challenges to making things in America, let alone just South Carolina. Let's not be naive about that. And the tariffs are really causing still a lot of havoc in terms of business planning. So that's curtailing investments that already had. That one in Florence, that was big. That was a big plant. Maybe it'll be restarted, but they said, if you read about it, there's still a lot of uncertainty about that, and they just can't move forward with it. Okay, so let me just summarize, and then we'll take some Q&A. I'll invite the other panelists back up here, but just to summarize, I think next year the K-shaped economy continues, a very unbalanced economy, very vulnerable to a correction in the stock market that could spill over into the whole economy in terms of spending and so forth. So consumption, again, next year will be constrained by inflation if we see this continual rise in inflation above the Federal Reserve's target, so that's a concern. Low and middle income shoppers, we can see them. Well, look at this Christmas season. We're going to learn a lot as we see how people spend in December now if they are curtailing on discretionary spending. So that's another thing we need to really look forward to. That's the 80% I'm talking about, who are increasingly just shopping at discount stores, at Walmart and other places like that. Other challenges, like I mentioned, the Fed faces this policy dilemma. They want to lower interest rates, but that can be potentially inflationary, and it's not even clear that they have control over long-term interest rates. So very uncertain about the long-term interest rates. But the opportunities for us, this is offsetting those potential negatives, is definitely government spending increases, like I mentioned, which is we're talking about trillions, capital investment, again, not just in AI, but in other industries as well. So we're an investment-driven economy here. We got a lot of incentives in South Carolina. We're well positioned to take advantage of what this big, beautiful bill has to offer. So that's all good for South Carolina. So I think I'll just leave it there and wish you happy holidays. This is AI generated, by the way. But I'd say make me a happy holidays image that depicts us here in South Carolina. And you know what? It really captured what I was looking for. So it only took 1 second. All right, so that's it. Thank you very much. And now we have some time for some questions for all of our panelists. All right, and okay, thank you. I'll be moderating here. So. All right, yes. Please stay for your question. Go ahead, yes.
You alluded to this, but considering the newer qualitative and quantitative gaps in government statistics,
yeah.
How difficult does this make your jobs, and how comfortable are you with imputed data? And I guess it's a new normal using more of the ADP and Indeed information. Yeah. And are you comfortable you're going to get realistic numbers going forward?
Oh, Okay,
answer
you go
that
ahead.
if
I'll
you
just say
want.
I'm not comfortable with that, and I'm talking about the government data for a lot of reasons. It's not their fault. They're good statisticians, but they're under a lot of political pressure.
Yeah.
But they're also lagging in terms of how, and then it gets revised. Sometimes we make predictions based on data, and then it gets revised. And, that's all we had to work with. That's not necessarily true with Indeed.
Yeah.
This is why this is so good.
Yeah, I think, even as much as I love the Indeed data, we rely heavily on BLS data too. And I think what I would say is that there have been issues with response rates that have not, this is an issue with every survey from every company or government agency. This has been going on for quite a while, and unfortunately, to fix that, you probably need additional investment. Like it's going to be an expensive issue to fix, and so decreasing the investment in it probably doesn't make the data quality any better. I do think they have extremely good methods, but the more we cut the budgets and have to impute more data, it becomes, if you're used to statistics, the standard errors are bigger, and so there are going to be larger revisions. There are going to be broader ranges of confidence intervals. So I'm definitely not comfortable with what's happened this year to those agencies. It's really, for us economists, it's really sad because we rely on the data so much, and also government data is used to do all sorts of things, right? To calculate how much money school district gets for Title I funding, and to decide, all sorts of things, decide who's urban, who's rural, and can get USDA grants, just a whole host of things. And so I'm hopeful that they can figure out a way to fix it, but it's been a tough year for the statistic government data world.
Steve.
We've had a number of conversations over the years, and you've repeatedly made comments how China is ahead of us in a lot of areas.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, why?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, they have a strategic policy and a long-term vision. Just take the EVs, for example. They've been working on coming to dominate this industry, and they really are. I mean, it's just unbelievable what's coming out of China right now in terms of, they're going to take over the whole car market if we don't watch it. But this isn't something they just decided to do yesterday. They've been working on this for at least 10 to 15 years, very focused on battery technology. They have engineers in battery technology. We don't have programs that do that anymore. Or take rare earth metals. They knew in the supply chain, this is how smart they are, that that's a critical part of the whole supply chain, and nobody else is doing it. So they put a lot of investment into that, and they built up huge economies of scale. So we say, we got to start that up again, but they've got a big lead on us because they can drive costs down. You're an economist, by the economies of scale. We're going to have a hard time doing that. We don't even have any program in rare earth engineering in the United States. I think they have 15 or 20 in China, for example. So they're very strategic about what they do. They have that long-term vision. And they're very, by the way, and this is relevant to our state, they're very manufacturing-oriented and creating linkages with the rest of the world. But finally, end-to-end supply chain. This is the way they think about it. We need to capture all of it, all right, in our country if we really want to benefit. I mean, there's a lot of other things I can say, but I'll just stop there. And, yeah, you have a follow-up. Well, we don't have a central Politburo or a Communist Party that can make those decisions. But let me say, it's not just that. I could recommend an economist to read named Jen. She has some YouTube videos, and she explains what's going on. It's very competitive among regions in China. Not everything comes from the top down. They set strategic goals, like we want to be in EVs, and then all the different regions compete to come up with the best one. And now they're shaking that out. They had hundreds, and now they're coming down to 4 or 5 big players. BYD is one of them, XPeng, and so forth. You know, at BYD right now, maybe you've heard of them, the EV manufacturer, they're building a factory that's it's the size of the land area of San Francisco. And they're going to building up the capacity to produce enough cars for the whole world. They're producing EVs right now that are really high quality in the $20,000 to $30,000 range. And if you look at countries that don't have tariffs, like Australia, because they don't have much of an auto industry, They're just completely taking it over right now. So that's, they have a lot, the other thing I would say, it's much more of a capitalist competitive economy than people give them credit for. A lot of top-down guidance and, and definitely strategic planning, but a very, very competitive economy at the ground level.
They already have capacity at 80%. If you look at the global vehicle production, they currently have the capacity to produce 80% of global demand, and that's only going to go up over the next decade.
So just to give you an example, if Cody was here, I think they're going to be selling the Scout at a price point around $60,000. They're already putting out equivalent kinds of EVs. I would say they're equivalent. Actually, that's a different kind of model. He explained that. They still have the old handles. No, they're not doing that. But they're putting in a lot of tech. And these cars in Australia are going for $20,000 to $30,000. Talk about deflation.
Yeah.
We might not experience that deflation. We're going to have a high-priced car economy because of these tariffs, while the rest of the world is buying new cars at half the price that we are, including Europe. What's that?
The average car in America this year costs $50,000, new car, for the first time.
That can't last, and only with tariffs could that persist. So that's what we're facing.
The back.
Yes, take a question. Go ahead. Okay. Well, I think, yes, they will last, but one of the problems for the data centers is they're buying, this goes into NVIDIA, you're making the chips for them. There's so much change going on with those chips. They're getting more advanced all the time. You can put in a data center with all these chips that we're basically spending the money for, and then new chips come along and that becomes outdated and you have to devalue those data centers. You know, that could happen, I don't know if in a couple of years, but it will happen over a fairly short time period. So that's a real challenge for a lot of what they're talking about doing when they're buying so much at once, when there's so much technological change, and whether they'll still be viable in a couple of years. But any other comments about that? Yeah. And how to tax them is something our state really should be thinking of, all states should be thinking about. We shouldn't be taxing them in the same way we usually think about manufacturing or other kinds of activities, because they're not generating many jobs. And all we can get in terms of value from them is going to be the tax revenue that comes in. Okay.
Right here.
Right here.
Portion on the bottom 10 sought after jobs, I saw retail and sales in there. As somebody who is part of a retail company, I was wondering, is there a larger story there besides just online shopping, taking everything over, or is that the whole story?
Yeah, that's most of the story, is that e-commerce just continues to grow. You know, it's not growing at as rapid a pace as we saw in like 2021, 22, but it is still growing. But automation is a big part of that too, right? If you think about, if you go into a retail store now, you know, I was thinking the other day, like almost every even convenience store I go in now has a self-checkout, right? And so there are just fewer and fewer retail workers needed because of automation as well.
I had a question to follow up on the gentleman's statement earlier. He was talking about China. In general, much of the conversation has been about domestic policy and domestic operations, but we live in a global economy. There's several things going on. You know, the Russia, the war is going to affect oil prices and things like that. China is a major player in AI and the chip market. Could you talk about the uncertainty from external things and maybe even internal as it relates to tariffs, how the global market will affect things that are going to take place here in the United States?
Yeah, we should look at the global market. One thing happened last year related to that is, we were trying to have this decoupling from China, get away from them. It's not entirely working very well, as we say. We're now reversing that. Even we're shipping our chips back to China. We're integrating back with them. We're even lowering tariffs. But what China has done with the decoupling is they're looking at other markets besides the United States. It's called the Belt and Road Initiative. You might have heard about that, but they've got deep trade linkages with the developing world. So 50% of their market is now in the developing world. That wasn't true 10 years ago. So they're, again, always looking ahead, looking at new markets, knowing the U.S. is clamping down, closing off a lot of opportunities for them, but they're looking elsewhere. And so to some extent, they're again, thinking strategically.
I saw a presentation just a few weeks ago by Goldman Sachs chief economist, and he showed some data that showed that, a lot of people with the tariffs with China, they thought it would hurt China's economy more than ours, but that has not happened. China has started importing a lot less U.S. goods because of it, but they're exporting more than ever. So their trade balance, like their gap between their imports and their exports, is larger than it was before. They've actually fared quite well because
it's just
of
forcing them
that.
to be more competitive, and that's what we've done to them. By putting this kind of pressure on them, not just with the tariffs, but by restricting exports of high advanced chips. So they started developing their own chip industry very quickly and catching up. We started worrying. Now we're worried about that. This is as a result, in part, of our own policies, forcing them to be more competitive.
And it's not just the chip market. The soybean, the government just bailed farmers out, and it's due to China changing suppliers on the soybean market as well.
Yeah, it's interesting about the soybean market because we were trying to use last year in my remark I talked about the Trump card, and that's our big market. We're using that as our big leverage and advantage. You want our market, you got to play by our rules. Well, China did the same thing with the soybeans, didn't they? And look, we had to back down because they've also got a big market, and we need that too. Okay, some other questions here.
Just a question here. Yeah, over here. Dr. Doug, thank you. Sorry, so you were talking about the K-shaped economy, and I had read some stuff on Bloomberg Economics, and we had been modeling it ourselves, but kind of what we found is that given a long-run elasticity of a capital-labor ratio that's greater than 1 in capital-biased technology, the growth in total factor productivity, kind of, essentially what Robert Solow would have argued for, isn't like a K-shaped economy essentially the norm in a very late-stage developed economy overall?
Well, that's a big economics question.
Yeah, that is a big
I'd have to spend a whole semester unpacking that. But to a large extent, what you're saying is true. We're a capitalist economy, and the gains go to the capitalists. Who are the capitalists? They're the asset owners, the people who own capital, and that hasn't changed, and it won't change next year.
Yeah, I would say though is I'm not sure the assumptions of that model, and of course in economics we make tons of assumptions, right? And this is a bigger question that I can answer in like 30 seconds, but I'm not sure the assumptions hold in a world where you really, like if you look at the S&P 500, I can't remember exactly what percentage of the stocks have actually grown in value, but it's a low percentage. Yeah. Like the wealth is accumulated in such a small percentage of the corporations as well, that I'm not sure it applies in the same way when you're looking at a K-shaped economy where the top 10 firms are basically reinvesting funds just with each other and getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. That doesn't, I don't think that holds in line with Solow's assumptions, if I remember my macro
Actually,
class.
I agree with that. I don't know if everyone else remembers the Solow model, so we want to get into, but that's a very good question. Okay. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Can I answer this one? Because I want to answer it in regards to the comments about the Federal Reserve, which I don't disagree with you about the money that was pumped into the economy. But I would go back, and this goes to your question too. To me, the biggest difference from what we were taught 20, 30 years ago about how to handle crisis or how to handle these sorts of things is that you used fiscal policy and monetary policy. And what I mean by that is when we borrowed out the wazoo for World War II, we then increased the top marginal tax rate in the United States to 91% until the mid-60s. pay that down, right? Now, I'm not saying we should, and by the way, that was on the equivalent of today's income of about $3 million. So think about if every dollar over $3 million a year, we were taxing at 91% at the federal rate. I do not argue for this, but that's what we did. The Federal Reserve is having to make decisions in the absence of any policy on the fiscal side other than just expansion, right? And so we've seen no matter who's president, we're just like spending money, taxing at lower and lower rates. This has been going on now since the 80s. And so I think you're right to be concerned about that. I think what we don't know, and I don't think we know, is when it becomes a problem. Because it's like, you know, the saying that Tom Barkin, who was the president of the Richmond Fed, he used to say, like, people would ask, like, how did you die? Well, very slowly and then all at once, right? Like things happen slowly and then one day it's just a problem. And so I think that's what we don't really know as economists.
Well, or whether... The other thing I'll say, the justification for this, actually, in the Trump administration, among the economists, they say the deficit won't be a problem. They're supply-siders. They say the economy is going to grow so much, that's going to generate the tax revenue. Well, you know, we've had that kind of argument before, and all we see is the deficit continue to go up, and sooner or later somebody's going to have to pay for that. That's true, and it looks like, at least for next year, it's going to be later, because we're not going to deal with it next year.
Well, when was the last time you saw consistent GDP growth at above 6%?
Yes,
I mean, that's what we would need in order to grow ourselves out of this debt, and, you know, you can look at the data, that's not going to happen, so, yeah.
Okay, yeah, Marion.
I wanted to ask you about, so you talked about kind of like the big layoffs from, you know,
Amazon,
Microsoft, UPS. How about small firms? Have you looked at what's going on with small businesses? And because like, I believe tariffs are affecting them in a big way too.
Yes. So tariffs are they affect small businesses more because it's harder for small businesses to find ways around tariff policy, right? It's hard for them to get exceptions and hard for them to find multiple supply chain options. So there have been, it's very interesting because there have been some more business failures, we think, this year, but there also has been a tremendous increase in the number of small businesses created in the past few years. So some of this data takes quite a while to come out. There's significant lags. I don't think we know the full story yet, but absolutely small firms are more highly impacted by some of these policy things that we've talked about. So I think the overall sentiment is that, that they have had a harder time navigating around that policy.
Laura, just a question, since you worked at the Federal Reserve. Like, obviously, for a long time, we've kind of been in a Ricardian regime where monetary policy is everything. But going forward, there's been a lot of discussion about a non-Ricardian regime where fiscal policy takes over and inflation increases because it's essentially the only way to return fiscal solvency. So I'm not sure if anybody has kind of basically the fiscal theory at the price level, if you have kind of any ideas if we're just going to move into a non-Ricardian regime where the Fed takes a back seat.
I think it's very hard to do that in a fiscal regime where you're not going to do both sides of the coin, which is when your economy is running hot, you raise taxes and cut spending. So if we're not going to do that side of it, then that is not going to work, because if you're just running hot on the fiscal side all the time and you take away that Federal Reserve lever, right, to raise rates, then you're going to have you could have hyperinflation in that case, in theory. Like, it could take over where you just were constantly dealing with upward pressures on inflation. So I don't know how that's possible in the current. This is why, you know, I used to, when I taught, students would tell you I would write on the board, economics does not equal politics, right? Because the political pressure to expand makes it very difficult to have a non-Ricardian regime, in my opinion.
Okay.
Dr. Woodward, I have a question.
We have some question back here, right here. Go ahead.
So what Mr. Thacker said about the headquarters for Scout going to Charlotte, he said specifically that they had the white-collar workforce that they needed. And I noticed in Joey's presentation that we're experiencing a decline in professional services, which I think captures a lot of that workforce. Is that trend unique to South Carolina, or is that nationwide? And if it is unique to South Carolina, it seems like we're trending in the wrong direction to try to attract a major headquarters like Scout. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I can start with that. I would say in general, so professional services has been more resilient in South Carolina compared to the national average, but only because we're not so targeted in the tech space. But I think when you're looking at the growth of headquarters, for example, and companies are looking for the workforce that they need, that's where they are looking at these larger cities where they've got more talent that is accessible, and that partly explains that location decision. And the question in terms of what we do about it, that becomes a long run challenge for the state in terms of how we recruit and retain more of our talent, and how do we effectively place them in positions that make it more attractive for companies to locate here. But that's, I think, is a broader trend, unless you may see something differently.
Yeah, if you look at the migration of like who's moving where, like in South Carolina, the reality is that many of the places that have had the strongest population growth, it's older Americans that are moving there. It's not 22 to 30-year-olds, and Charlotte has had a lot of growth in that 22 to 30. I mean, you go to the South End area in Charlotte, that's all that is there. It's thousands and thousands of these young professionals, and they're building their headquarters in Plaza Midwood, which is another like cool place to live. And so I think, you put your headquarters in a cool city, in a cool neighborhood, and I think they think these young professionals will come. And South Carolina has some of that in some of the MSAs, but Myrtle Beach, Hilton Head, Charleston, a lot of that growth is actually 55 plus.
I just want to quickly add to that. This was a real lesson what Scout did, in putting their R&D and headquarters in Charlotte and the production here, and that's what we call in economics functional specialization. We're specializing in production. Charlotte is a corporate city. It's got the legal services, it's got accounting services. It's above all else, it's got that airport. And when executives are making a decision where to put a headquarters, when they can make direct flights to places, that's a big part of the decision making. We can't compete to that. We should be lucky that it is close to us, that we can drive there quickly. So
and we will get some of those
spillover effects. That's a reality.
Yeah, a lot of those people that work there will live down in northern South Carolina with me.
Yeah, we'll get
be in Rock Hill with me.
So it sets up the entire I-77 corridor for future development and growth as well. So that can be very positive looking forward.
Dr. Woodward, I had a question. It is related to AI stock surge, which has happened in the last 1 year, especially. So a lot of people are saying that it is a bubble which is going to burst. So if it really does, do you think it might have a spillover impact on the overall economy?
Yes, I hinted at that before, because in a way that's kind of been holding up. People are feeling very confident when they see that stock market. They don't know how imbalanced that is. And if we see that bubble burst, yes, it will definitely have spillover effects. And just in creating a lot more anxiety in the economy in the one part that would seem like it was always positive, then what do we have left? And I think it'll cause a lot of pessimism, consumer retrenchment. So we're very, very vulnerable to that. I'm not making any predictions. I don't make predictions about the financial markets. But I will say if that were to happen, and it hasn't happened in a while, then what we'd have to see is a lot of pressure on the Federal Reserve to come in and pump up that liquidity again. That's what they did last time, right, in 2020. So, yes, back here.
I've got a question from our online participants. Eleanor asked, Dr. Woodward, I am interested in the sustainability of this government spending increase long term. What impacts would we expect from this?
Well, that younger generation is going to have to figure out how to pay for it, and they're not going to get anything from it. This is one of the biggest frustrations. When you're paying taxes and you think you're actually getting something in return for that, like they're fixing our roads, filling in the potholes, that's one thing. But when you're just paying off debt service, when debt service gets to a certain, it's not the debt, it's the debt service that you pay off every year that I think is the biggest concern. And so there's just we're passing that off, and we've been doing that, I think, for as long as I've been up here for 38 years. I don't know if we can do it another 38 years though. So we've got to be worried about that and how to bring it down. Everyone talks about it, but it didn't happen with a big beautiful bill, and nothing's going to resolve next year. I will just finally say one thing about that, though, and this has to do with the Federal Reserve. One thing they can do is they can come in and buy up all of that debt, take it off the market. That's what they do with quantitative easing. They buy up that debt. And then you have to ask yourself the question, Well, if the Federal Reserve owns this government debt that otherwise our young people are going to have to pay for, why do we have to pay them? They can just return the money back to the Treasury, the interest payments, the debt service. And in fact, they do. So I think that's something like we're going to see. We're going to see a lot of the Federal Reserve action to try to sop up a lot of this debt, and then we don't have to pay them. We have to pay off everybody else. I'm not advocating necessarily as a policy, but I think that's at least one way out, okay, if you understand what I'm saying, okay? Oh, all right. Anybody else? Okay. We'll take one more question. How about that? Are you asking what should they like study or what should they major in? That's all. Well, I'll tell you, in this economy, in terms of survival, and this goes in, I hope Joey will weigh in on this too, but in a capitalist economy like we're in, and this goes back to that K-shaped economy, I would tell young people, start investing. You know, you've got to accumulate wealth. You can't just depend on wage income. You've got to invest as much as you can in your 401k, find a way to buy a house, find a way to own assets. That's something they don't often think about. So when they get a job, and we could talk about what jobs are, well, we were just hearing from Laura what kinds of jobs have the most promise. And that's always changing. But that's the number one advice I'd give to young people is we don't save enough in this country. The Chinese do. They save a lot. You know, we save very little. And by that, I mean, then you can accumulate wealth because we see that's where so many of the gains are going to go. So I start getting into that game, learn about it, and start investing. That's what anything you want to add?
Yeah, and I would just say from a career front, make sure that you're trying to understand where you can be marketable and where you can be most effective in the job market, and that follows your interests. It also follows what's in high demand. And I'll tell you another skill that I think we need to, that more students need to emphasize, and I can't speak to how much this is emphasized in K through 12, but public speaking, I think is a skill that is underappreciated, because regardless of what field you're going in, if you can communicate your expertise to an audience, that is a very valuable skill. And when you marry that to whatever your profession is, that's going to make you far more competitive. That's certainly something that that I see on a regular basis that really allows people to stand out. But beyond that, being familiar with where the job market is going. And one thing we haven't talked about as much today as well is the trades. There's still a major shortage in the trades, and these are, if you look at starting salaries there, they are in the six figures, and we see those positions making very good money, being trained at a fairly reasonable cost and through different certification programs. So just kind of casting the net on looking at where the high demand is, and then I think public speaking skills is good for any profession in terms of making students more competitive.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for coming today. I want to again wish you a happy holiday. I'd also want to thank our sponsors, and especially, again, I want to thank our staff. We have a lot of excellent staff that work behind the scenes, and they did a great job. So a round of applause for them, okay? All right, that concludes our conference. Thank you very much.